The clash of steel that would echo through 3 decades of English history began not with a single dramatic confrontation, but through the gradual accumulation of grievances, failures, and ambitions that transformed the peaceful succession of monarchs into a brutal struggle for the very soul of the kingdom. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The roots of the conflict that would later be termed the Wars of the Roses extended deep into the 14th century, when Edward III's remarkable fertility created an abundance of potential claimants to the English throne that would prove catastrophic for the stability of the realm. Edward's 7 sons who survived to adulthood established powerful noble houses whose descendants would wage war against each other for generations, transforming legitimate genealogical claims into instruments of military ambition and political destruction. The king's 3rd son, Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, died in 1368, leaving only a daughter, Philippa, whose marriage to Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, created a line of descent that would eventually support the Yorkist claim to the throne through complex inheritance patterns that privileged genealogical seniority over gender restrictions and practical political considerations. Edward's 4th son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, established the Lancastrian line through his son Henry Bolingbroke, who would seize the throne as Henry IV in 1399, creating a precedent for violent usurpation that undermined the sanctity of hereditary succession and established might as a legitimate path to royal power. The deposition of Richard II, Edward III's grandson through the Black Prince, represented the first major rupture in the orderly transmission of royal authority, as Henry Bolingbroke's superior military position and political support among the nobility enabled him to overthrow a legitimate king whose autocratic tendencies and questionable judgment had alienated powerful factions within the Fandis realm. The Lancastrian usurpation of 1399 created constitutional and genealogical problems that would fester for decades, as the Mortimer descendants through Lionel of Antwerp possessed technically superior claims to the throne, based on primogeniture principles that should have elevated their rights above those of John of Gaunt's line. The execution of Richard II in 1400, whether through deliberate murder or forced starvation in captivity at Pontefract Castle, eliminated the immediate threat of restoration, but created a martyr whose memory would inspire opposition to Lancastrian rule throughout the 15th century. Henry IV's reign, from 1399 to 1413, was characterized by constant challenges to his authority, including the Percy Rebellion in the north, Owain Glyndwr's Welsh uprising, and various plots to restore the Mortimer line or avenge Richard II's death. These challenges required military expenditure and political concessions that weakened royal authority, while strengthening the position of the nobility who controlled the military resources necessary for the king's survival. The king's declining health during his final years, possibly due to leprosy or another disfiguring disease that contemporary chronicles described in moralistic terms as divine punishment for usurpation, reduced his ability to govern effectively and created opportunities for factional politics that would characterize the later Lancastrian period. Henry V's accession in 1413 temporarily restored Lancastrian prestige through his remarkable military successes in France, particularly the stunning victory at Agincourt in 1415, where English longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms defeated a much larger French force under conditions that demonstrated both English military prowess and French tactical incompetence. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 represented the high point of Lancastrian achievement, as Henry secured recognition as heir to the French throne and regent of France during Charles VI's lifetime, effectively creating a dual monarchy that promised to unite England and France under a single crown. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French king, legitimized this arrangement through dynastic ties that should have secured peaceful succession to both thrones. However, Henry's premature death in 1422, possibly from dysentery, contracted during the Siege of Meaux, left his infant son Henry VI as king of both England and France under circumstances that required extended regency government and created opportunities for noble factionalism that the strong personal rule of Henry V had suppressed. The death of Charles VI of France only 2 months after Henry V's passing meant that the infant Henry VI inherited claims to both kingdoms while possessing neither the age nor capacity to defend them against the military and political challenges that immediately arose. The regency government established to rule during Henry VI's minority represented a compromise between various noble factions whose competing interests and ambitions created the structural conditions for later civil conflict. John, Duke of Bedford, Henry V's brother, assumed primary responsibility for French affairs and military operations designed to consolidate English control over territories recognized in the Treaty of Troyes. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, another of Henry V's brothers, claimed the regency in England but faced opposition from the Royal Council, which limited his authority and created institutional checks on his power that reflected noble concerns about concentrated authority in the hands of a single individual. Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester and later Cardinal, emerged as a third major figure in the regency government, using his position as the wealthiest prelate in England and his status as a legitimized descendant of John of Gaunt through his relationship with Catherine Swynford to exert influence over royal policy and financial matters. The Beaufort family's legitimization through parliamentary statute during Richard II's reign had specifically excluded them from the royal succession, but their wealth, connections, and proximity to the royal family gave them enormous influence over government operations during the minority and beyond. The gradual deterioration of English military position in France during the 1420s and 1430s undermined the Lancastrian regime's prestige and created financial pressures that required increased taxation, parliamentary cooperation that strengthened the political position of the nobility and gentry classes. The emergence of Joan of Arc in 1429 as a charismatic military leader who inspired French resistance and secured the coronation of Charles VII at Reims, challenged English claims to French sovereignty, demonstrated that the Treaty of Troyes had failed to secure French acceptance of English rule. The death of the Duke of Bedford in 1435 removed the most capable military commander and administrator from English service in France, leaving military operations under the direction of less competent nobles, whose strategic errors and tactical failures accelerated the erosion of English territorial control. The Congress of Arras in 1435, which resulted in the defection of Burgundy from the English alliance to reconciliation with Charles VII, eliminated England's most powerful continental ally and created strategic conditions that made the long-term retention of French territories increasingly difficult. Despite continued English military efforts and substantial financial expenditure, Henry VI's assumption of personal rule in 1437 occurred under circumstances that quickly revealed his profound unsuitability for medieval kingship, as his gentle, pious temperament and apparent lack of interest in martial activities or aggressive political leadership stood in sharp contrast to the qualities expected of successful 15th-century monarchs. The king's preference for religious observances, educational patronage, and peaceful resolution of conflicts reflected admirable personal qualities that proved disastrous in the context of 15th-century political realities, which required monarchs to demonstrate military prowess, distribute patronage effectively, and maintain authority through combinations of fear and respect that Henry seemed constitutionally incapable of generating. Contemporary chronicles and later historical analyses have debated whether Henry suffered from mental illness, inherited from his French grandfather Charles VI, or simply possessed a personality fundamentally unsuited to the demands of kingship. But the practical result was a power vacuum at the center of government that competing noble factions rushed to fill through their control of royal councils, manipulation of patronage networks, and cultivation of their own military resources. The king's marriage to Margaret of Anjou in 1445, arranged as part of diplomatic negotiations that also involved the surrender of Maine to French control, brought to England a queen whose forceful personality political ambition, and fierce devotion to protecting her husband's interests and their son's inheritance would make her the effective leader of the Lancastrian cause during the conflicts to come. Margaret's arrival in England at the age of 15 placed her in a political environment where her French origins, her association with the unpopular surrender of territorial claims in France, and her lack of the substantial dowry typically expected of royal brides created immediate hostility among English nobles who resented French influence over royal policy. The Queen's beauty, intelligence, and strong will impressed some contemporaries while alienating others who found her political involvement inappropriate for a woman and her advocacy for unpopular policies damaging to English interests. Her relationship with William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, who had negotiated her marriage and dominated royal government during the late 1440s, created suspicions of improper influence that contributed to Suffolk's eventual downfall and demonstrated the dangers facing royal favourites who accumulated power without corresponding military success or popular support. The final collapse of English power in France between 1449 and 1453 eliminated virtually all continental territories that had been won through generations of military effort and enormous expenditure of English blood and treasure. The loss of Normandy in 1450, accomplished through a French military campaign that systematically reduced English strongholds despite desperate defensive efforts, represented both a strategic catastrophe and a psychological blow to English prestige that undermined confidence in Lancastrian government and created widespread perception of royal incompetence and divine disfavour. The fall of Bordeaux in 1453 ended English control of Gascony, which had been connected to the English crown since the 12th century through Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage to Henry II, severing economic ties that had enriched English merchants and provided substantial customs revenue to the royal treasury. The magnitude of this collapse, which reduced English continental holdings to a single city, Calais, could not be attributed solely to military factors, but reflected deeper problems of financial exhaustion, strategic confusion, and political division that prevented the coordination of effective resistance to French military pressure. The political consequences of military failure fell primarily on William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, whose monopolization of royal favour and identification with failed French policies made him the target of parliamentary impeachment proceedings in 1450 that reflected both legitimate grievances about governmental incompetence, factional manoeuvring by his political enemies. Suffolk's murder in May of 1450, following his exile by the king in response to parliamentary pressure, occurred when his ship was intercepted in the English Channel by vessels whose crew took the Duke prisoner and executed him without legal authority, leaving his body on the beach at Dover in a display that demonstrated the breakdown of legal order and the willingness of powerful interests to employ violence against royal favourites. The identity of those responsible for Suffolk's death remained officially unknown, though suspicions focused on political enemies who benefited from his removal and wished to prevent any possibility of his restoration to royal favour. The king's inability to protect his chief minister or punish those responsible for his murder demonstrated the weakness of royal authority and encouraged other nobles to pursue their political objectives through violence rather than legal channels. Jack Cade's rebellion, which erupted in Kent only weeks after Suffolk's death in June of 1450, reflected widespread popular discontent with governmental corruption, military failure, and the economic burdens created by unsuccessful French wars, though the rebellion's leadership and organisation suggested coordination with noble factions opposed to the court party. Cade's forces, numbering several thousand men drawn from the commons of Kent and Sussex, marched on London, demanding governmental reform, punishment of corrupt officials, and the recall of Richard, Duke of York, from his position as Lieutenant of Ireland, where he had been effectively exiled to remove him from English politics. The rebels' ability to defeat royal forces at the Battle of Saltfields on June 25, 1450, demonstrated serious problems with military organisation and morale that allowed a force of commoners to overcome troops commanded by experienced nobles. The government's loss of control over London, which the rebels occupied for several days in early July, represented an unprecedented humiliation that forced the king to flee and enabled the rebels to execute several unpopular officials, including Lords Say and Selle, whose summary execution illustrated the violent popular anger against perceived governmental corruption. The rebellion's eventual suppression, accomplished through a combination of military pressure and promises of pardon that induced most rebels to disperse, failed to address the underlying grievances that had motivated the uprising, or to restore confidence in governmental competence and effectiveness. Richard, Duke of York, emerged during the early 1450s as the focal point for opposition to the court party, led by Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who had assumed Suffolk's position as the king's chief advisor and bore responsibility for the final military disasters in France. York's position as the wealthiest and most powerful noble in England, combined with his genealogical claim to the throne through his descent from both Lionel of Antwerp and Edmund of Langley, Edward III's fifth son, made him the natural leader for nobles who opposed Somerset's influence over the king and sought changes in governmental policy. York's exclusion from royal councils and his appointment as Lieutenant of Ireland in 1449 represented attempts by the court party to marginalize a potential rival whose military competence, administrative ability, and genealogical claims made him dangerous to their political dominance. The Duke's return from Ireland in September of 1450, undertaken without royal permission in response to rumours that his enemies planned to accuse him of treason, initiated a period of escalating political confrontation that would eventually collapse into armed conflict. York's initial attempts to achieve political influence through legal and constitutional channels demonstrated his preference for working within established governmental structures rather than immediately resorting to force, though his mobilization of military retainers and armed confrontations with royal forces indicated his willingness to use violence if necessary to protect his position and advance his political objectives. His first armed demonstration of strength occurred in early 1452, when he gathered a substantial military force and advanced toward London, demanding the removal of Somerset from royal favour and his own appointment to the royal council, with influence commensurate with his status as the premier nobleman of the realm. The king's refusal to dismiss Somerset, or grant York the political position he demanded, led to a tense standoff at Dartford in March of 1452, where York's forces confronted the royal army but ultimately dispersed without fighting, when York realised he lacked sufficient support among other nobles to challenge royal authority successfully. The peaceful resolution of the Dartford confrontation required York to submit to royal authority and accept temporary political humiliation, but it also demonstrated the limits of the court party's power and the potential for armed conflict if political disputes could not be resolved through negotiation and compromise. The king's mental collapse in August of 1453 fundamentally altered the political landscape by removing the nominal source of governmental authority and creating a succession crisis when Queen Margaret gave birth to a son, Edward of Westminster, in October, while the king remained incapable of recognizing his heir or performing any royal functions. The nature of Henry's illness remains debated by historians, with some arguing for a complete catatonic state in which the king could not speak, move, or respond to stimuli, while others suggest a less severe condition that nonetheless rendered him incapable of governing effectively. The timing of the king's collapse, occurring only months after the final loss of English territories in France and coinciding with Queen Margaret's pregnancy, suggested to contemporaries either divine judgment on Lancastrian failures or the psychological impact of military disaster on a king whose mental stability had always been questionable. The absence of precedents for managing a completely incapacitated king created constitutional confusion that different political factions attempted to exploit according to their particular interests and genealogical positions. Queen Margaret's attempts to establish a regency under her own authority, claiming the right to govern on behalf of her incapacitated husband and infant son, challenged English political traditions that had never recognized a queen's right to exercise royal power independently of her husband. The queen's French origins and her identification with unpopular policies made her regency claims particularly controversial among nobles, who feared that accepting female governance would subordinate English interests to French, influence and perpetuate the failed policies of the previous decade. The political stalemate, created by competing claims to governmental authority during the king's illness, ultimately resolved in favour of Richard, Duke of York, who secured appointment as Protector of the Realm in March of 1454 through his ability to mobilise parliamentary support and demonstrate to sceptical nobles that his governance would protect their interests while excluding the Queen and her associates from power. York's protectorate, while legally justified through parliamentary authorization and precedents from Henry VI's minority, represented a fundamental shift in political power that displaced the court party and installed the Duke's allies in key governmental and military positions. The Duke's administration as protector demonstrated both his governmental competence and his determination to exclude his enemies from power, as he removed Somerset from office and imprisoned him in the Tower of London on charges related to the loss of French territories, while promoting his own supporters to positions of authority throughout the governmental apparatus. York's attempts to reform royal finances, reduce household expenditure, and address popular grievances about corruption and misgovernment won him support among the commons and merchant communities, who hoped that effective leadership might restore economic prosperity and political stability. However, his policies also created intense opposition from nobles who had benefited from court patronage and viewed his protectorate as a temporary aberration that would end when the king recovered. The Duke's moderate exercise of power during the protectorate, including his refusal to make aggressive moves toward the throne despite his genealogical claims, suggested that he genuinely sought to work within existing constitutional frameworks rather than immediately pursuing royal ambitions, though his enemies interpreted his restraint as tactical calculation rather than principled commitment to lawful governance. Henry VI's recovery of his mental faculties in early 1455 created the conditions for renewed political conflict, as the king's restoration to active governance immediately triggered the reversal of York's governmental arrangements and the return to power of the Queen's party, led by Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. The speed with which the court party moved to exclude York and his allies from government, release Somerset from imprisonment, and restore previous power structures demonstrated that the king's illness had changed nothing fundamental about the political divisions that separated competing noble factions. York's loss of the protectorate and his exclusion from the royal council left him vulnerable to the revenge of his enemies, who began preparing charges of treason that would have resulted in his attainder, execution, and the destruction of his family's position and prospects. The Duke's decision to resort to armed resistance rather than submit to what he perceived as judicial murder initiated the actual military phase of the conflict that would consume England for the next 3 decades. The First Battle of the Wars of the Roses occurred at Street, Albans on May 22, 1455, when Richard, Duke of York, together with his allies, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and his own son-in-law, and York's brother-in-law Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, Warwick's father, intercepted the royal court as it travelled north from London. York's force, numbering approximately 3,000 men, took up positions blocking the roads into Street, Albans, where the king's party, travelling with a similar number of armed retainers, sought shelter within the town's limited fortifications. The battle began with negotiations in which York demanded the surrender of Somerset and other advisers he blamed for governmental failures, while the king refused to hand over his nobles to what he perceived as rebel justice. The fighting that followed was brief but decisive, lasting only a few hours, as Warwick's forces found a way through the town's defences and attacked the king's position from an unexpected direction. The death of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, during the street fighting, along with the Earl of Northumberland and Lord Clifford, eliminated the leadership of the court party and left the king himself wounded by an arrow in the neck, requiring the victorious Yorkists to provide medical care for the monarch they claimed to be defending against evil counsellors. The aftermath of Street, Albans demonstrated the fundamental ambiguity of the Yorkist position, as the victors insisted they had fought only to protect themselves from unjust persecution and to remove evil counsellors from royal presence, not to challenge the king's legitimate authority or to advance York's own claims to the throne. This constitutional fiction, which would be maintained throughout the late 1450s, required elaborate shows of loyalty and submission to royal authority, even as the Yorkists monopolised governmental power and excluded their enemies from influence. York's Second Protectorate, established in November of 1455, following another episode of royal mental instability, or perhaps simple political manipulation of the king's malleable will, formalised Yorkist control over government, while maintaining the pretense of acting as the king's faithful servants, protecting his interests against bad advice. The release of Henry Percy, the new Earl of Northumberland, and Henry, Lord Clifford, son of the Lord, killed at Street. Albans, from Yorkist captivity in 1456, despite their obvious hostility to the regime, demonstrated either York's political miscalculation or his genuine commitment to reconciliation, as both nobles would become committed Lancastrian military leaders who contributed to the eventual Yorkist defeat. Queen Margaret's withdrawal from London to the Midlands during 1456 represented her recognition that she could not effectively contest Yorkist control over the capital and the southeastern regions, where their power was strongest. The Queen's establishment of an alternative governmental centre at Coventry, where she gathered loyal nobles and maintained a rival court with her young son as the symbolic focus of Lancastrian legitimacy, created a divided realm with two competing sources of political authority claiming to speak for the same king. Margaret's success in maintaining noble support, despite the Yorkist victory at Street, Albans reflected both personal loyalty to the royal family and noble concerns about York's increasing dominance, which threatened to create a new power monopoly as objectionable as the previous court party's control. The Queen's ability to present herself as the defender of her son's inheritance against Yorkist ambitions that might eventually extend to deposing Henry and installing York as king provided a powerful rallying point for nobles, whose own genealogical claims and family positions depended on maintaining the principle of hereditary succession against might-based claims to power. The uneasy political balance maintained between 1455 and 1459 broke down as both sides prepared for renewed military conflict that neither party seemed able to prevent through negotiation or compromise. The Loveday ceremony in March of 1458, orchestrated by the king himself as a public reconciliation between the rival parties, required the Yorkist lords and the heirs of those killed at Street, Albans to process together through London in a display of unity that convinced no one of genuine peace. The symbolic performance of reconciliation, with York walking hand in hand with Queen Margaret, while Salisbury and Warwick accompanied their victims' sons, demonstrated the superficiality of attempts to resolve through ceremony the deep political divisions and personal hatreds that separated the factions. The continued preparation for war on both sides, including the mobilization of armed retainers, the stockpiling of weapons and supplies, and the formation of military alliances that drew in nobles from across England, indicated that all parties recognized the inevitability of renewed conflict, despite official proclamations of peace and unity. The Yorkist lords' flight from court in late 1459, undertaken when they learned of plans for their arrest and trial on charges of treason, transformed the political conflict into open military confrontation as both sides mobilized their full resources for a decisive struggle. The Lancastrian victory at Blore Heath on September 23, 1459, where Lord Audley's forces attacked Salisbury's army as it marched to join York's main force, demonstrated that the court party possessed both the will and capability to challenge Yorkist military supremacy. Salisbury's ultimate victory in the battle, achieved through defensive tactics that allowed his experienced soldiers to defeat Audley's larger but less organized force, enabled him to reach Ludlow and unite with York's main army, creating a combined Yorkist force of substantial size. However, the royal armies advanced toward Ludlow with forces that significantly outnumbered the Yorkist host, created strategic conditions that forced York to accept battle under disadvantageous circumstances or retreat from England entirely. The encounter at Ludford Bridge on October 12, 1459, resulted not in battle, but in the collapse of Yorkist resistance, when a substantial portion of their army, including the experienced soldiers from the Calais garrison under Andrew Trollope, defected to the royal forces after concluding they could not in good conscience fight against their anointed king, who was personally present on the battlefield with his banner displayed. The defection revealed the weakness of the Yorkist constitutional position, which claimed loyalty to the king while fighting against royal forces, a contradiction that many soldiers found impossible to accept when confronted with the king's actual presence. The flight of York, Salisbury, Warwick, and York's son Edward, Earl of March, to separate refuges in Ireland and Calais represented a catastrophic defeat that should have ended their political careers and vindicated Lancastrian authority. The Parliament of Devils, convened at Coventry in November of 1459, formalised the Yorkist defeat through acts of attainder that condemned the rebel lords as traitors, confiscated their lands and property, and theoretically destroyed their families' positions, rendering them outlaws subject to summary execution if captured. The Yorkist recovery from the disaster at Ludford Bridge demonstrated the resilience of their cause and the weakness of Lancastrian authority, even in apparent victory. Warwick's position as captain of Calais, which he had obtained during York's first protectorate and managed to retain despite the change in government, provided him with a secure base possessing substantial military resources, including the garrison soldiers and naval vessels that made Calais the most important English military installation outside the home islands. The Earl's raids on English coastal areas during the winter and spring of 1459 and 1460 undermined Lancastrian prestige, while demonstrating the government's inability to protect English commerce or prevent rebel forces from operating freely in the Channel. York's position in Ireland, where his earlier service as lieutenant had established relationships with Anglo-Irish nobility and Gaelic chieftains, provided another secure base beyond Lancastrian reach, though his distance from England limited his ability to influence events during the crucial period leading to renewed conflict. The Yorkist invasion of England in June and July of 1460 caught the Lancastrian government unprepared for coordinated assaults on multiple fronts that divided royal forces and prevented effective concentration against either invasion force. Warwick's landing in Kent, with an army recruited from the Calais garrison and supplemented by English exiles and Burgundian mercenaries, enabled him to advance rapidly on London, which opened its gates to the Yorkist forces on July 2nd, 1460, providing both legitimacy and resources that transformed his position from that of an outlaw to an alternative source of governmental authority. The capture of several prominent Lancastrians in London, including Lord Rivers and his son Anthony Woodville, demonstrated the risks facing nobles who found themselves in the wrong location when political fortunes shifted suddenly. Edward, Earl of March's landing in Wales, with forces recruited in Ireland and among Welsh supporters of the Yorkist cause, created additional pressure on Lancastrian military resources, while threatening royal power in regions that had traditionally supported the crown. The Battle of Northampton, on July 10th, 1460, represented the decisive military confrontation that destroyed Lancastrian authority and created the conditions for fundamental constitutional changes that moved beyond the previous fiction of loyal service to the king toward explicit challenges to Henry's right to rule. Warwick's army, which had advanced north from London, with the young Duke of Buckingham nominally in command to provide aristocratic legitimacy to military operations, led primarily by the Earl himself, encountered the king's forces positioned behind defensive fieldworks near Northampton. The royal army's prepared defences should have provided significant advantages, as the entrenchments, stakes, and artillery positions created obstacles that attacking forces would need to overcome under fire. However, the betrayal of Lord Grey of Ruthin, who commanded a substantial portion of the Lancastrian forces and had secretly agreed to support the Yorkist cause, enabled Warwick's men to penetrate the defensive lines without serious opposition from the section under Grey's control. The brief but brutal fighting that followed resulted in the deaths of Buckingham, Lord Egremont, and other prominent Lancastrian nobles, while the king himself was captured and fell under Yorkist control, creating a situation where the victors physically possessed the source of governmental authority and could claim to act in his name regardless of his actual wishes. The political situation following Northampton presented the Yorkists with choices about how to utilize their military victory and possession of the king to achieve their political objectives, while managing the constitutional complications created by their rebellion against an anointed monarch. The immediate governmental arrangements treated Henry as a legitimate king who had been rescued from evil counsellors, a constitutional fiction that allowed the Yorkists to exercise power in the king's name while maintaining official respect for his royal status. However, Richard, Duke of York's return from Ireland in September of 1460, accompanied by claims to the throne based on his genealogical descent from Lionel of Antwerp and Edmund of Langley, transformed the political situation from a struggle over governmental control into a direct challenge to Lancastrian legitimacy. York's dramatic entry into the Parliament chamber on October 10th, 1460, where he approached the empty throne and placed his hand upon it in a gesture that contemporaries interpreted as a claim to immediate possession of royal authority, who had fought to control government in the king's name rather than to replace the king himself. The parliamentary debates that followed York's claim to the throne revealed the complex legal and political issues surrounding competing genealogical arguments about rightful succession, as lawyers and lords examined the relative merits of claims based on descent through female lines against arguments that sustained possession and parliamentary recognition created legitimate authority, regardless of strict primogeniture principles. York's case rested on the assertion that his descent from Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second surviving son, provided superior genealogical claim compared to Henry's descent from John of Gaunt, the third surviving son, making the entire Lancastrian dynasty illegitimate usurpers who had stolen the throne from its rightful possessors. The Lancastrian response emphasized the practical reality that 3 generations of kings, recognized by Parliament and anointed in sacred coronation ceremonies, had ruled England, creating prescriptive, right-through-long possession that should override theoretical genealogical arguments about primogeniture. The political stalemate, created by these incompatible positions, ultimately resolved through the Act of Accord, adopted on October 24, 1460, which represented a compromise that recognized Henry VI as legitimate king during his lifetime, while designating York and his heirs as successors to the throne, disinheriting Henry's son Edward of Westminster, and fundamentally altering the succession in ways that guaranteed continued conflict. Queen Margaret's rejection of any settlement that disinherited her son transformed her from a partisan of one court faction into an implacable enemy of the Yorkist regime, who would spend the next decade fighting to restore her son's inheritance and destroy those who had stolen his birthright. The Queen's position in the north, where she had gathered Lancastrian loyalists and Scottish allies willing to support her cause in exchange for territorial concessions, provided a base for military operations that threatened to overturn the political settlement achieved through the Act of Accord. The Northern Lords' support for Margaret reflected both personal loyalty to the royal family and regional opposition to southern domination, as northern nobles resented the concentration of power among nobles whose primary estates lay in southern and eastern England, the Somerset, Northumberland, and Clifford families, all of which had lost members at Street. Albans and possessed hereditary grievances against the Yorkist lords formed the core of Margaret's military support and provided experienced commanders for the Lancastrian armies that would contest Yorkist authority. Richard, Duke of York's advance northward in December of 1460, with forces intended to suppress Lancastrian resistance, demonstrated either remarkable military confidence or dangerous miscalculation of enemy strength, determination, as he divided his forces and advanced into hostile territory, where local populations supported the Lancastrian cause. The Duke's decision to spend Christmas at Sandal Castle near Wakefield, accompanied by his second son Edmund, Earl of Rutland, and his brother-in-law, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, placed his forces in an exposed position, surrounded by larger Lancastrian armies that controlled the surrounding territory. The Battle of Wakefield, on December 30th, 1460, resulted in catastrophic Yorkist defeat when York's forces left the safety of Sandal Castle to engage Lancastrian troops under circumstances that remain controversial, with contemporary accounts disagreeing about whether York fell into a trap, responded to a violation of a Christmas truce, or simply made a tactical error in accepting battle under disadvantageous conditions. The death of Richard, Duke of York, in the fighting, ended the life of the man whose genealogical claims and political ambitions had initiated the conflict, while the capture and execution of the Earl of Salisbury following the battle eliminated another major Yorkist leader, whose military experience and family connections had been crucial to their cause. The treatment of Yorkist nobles killed at Wakefield or captured and executed afterward demonstrated the increasing brutality that characterized the conflict, as initial restraints on violence against anointed nobility broke down under the pressure of sustained warfare and accumulated personal grievances. The execution of Edmund, Earl of Rutland, only 17 years old, either during or immediately after the battle, violated traditional practices that typically spared young nobles who might be ransomed or whose youth made them less culpable for their father's political choices. Contemporary accounts attributed Rutland's death to John, Lord Clifford, whose father had been killed at Street Albans, suggesting that personal revenge motivated the killing and demonstrated how family blood feuds had become intertwined with political conflicts. The display of York's head, adorned with a paper crown in mockery of his royal ambitions, on the gates of York City, along with the heads of Salisbury and Rutland, represented propaganda designed to humiliate enemies and demonstrate Lancastrian power. But it also hardened Yorkist determination to avenge these insults to their leader's dignity and their family's honour. The Lancastrian military advantage gained through the victory at Wakefield enabled Queen Margaret to advance southward with a large army that included substantial Scottish and Northern English contingents whose undisciplined behaviour and tendency toward plunder created fear and resentment among the populations through whose territories they marched. The army's progress toward London represented both a military threat to Yorkist control of the capital and the government, and a test of whether the Queen could maintain discipline among her heterogeneous forces and secure support from southern populations traditionally suspicious of northern power. Warwick's attempt to block the Lancastrian advance resulted in the Second Battle of Street Albans on February 17, 1461, where Margaret's forces defeated the Yorkist army, despite their smaller numbers, through superior tactics and the exploitation of Warwick's defensive errors. The Lancastrian recovery of King Henry VI during the battle restored the person of the king to Margaret's custody, enabling her to claim governmental legitimacy that had been absent while Henry remained under Yorkist control. However, the failure to capture or kill Warwick, who escaped with remnants of his army and substantial military resources, prevented the Queen from completely destroying Yorkist military power. London's refusal to open its gates to the Lancastrian army following the victory at Second Street Albans demonstrated the Queen's political weakness and the extent to which her reliance on Northern and Scottish troops had alienated the southern populations, whose support was essential for establishing effective governmental control. The city's merchants and aldermen, fearing both the plunder that had characterized the Lancastrian army's march south and the financial demands that would accompany Lancastrian victory, chose to maintain their gates closed and await the arrival of Edward, Earl of March, the new Yorkist claimant, following his father's death at Wakefield. Margaret's failure to force entry into London, whether through military assault or negotiation, represented a crucial strategic error that allowed the Yorkists to recover from their defeats and regroup around the 19-year-old Edward, whose military competence and physical presence provided leadership that the Yorkist cause desperately needed. Edward's victory at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross on February 2nd, 1461, had demonstrated his military abilities and prevented a Lancastrian force under Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, from joining with Queen Margaret's main army, allowing Edward to advance on London with the military forces necessary to secure the city and claim governmental authority. The battle, fought in Herefordshire near the Welsh border, resulted in decisive Yorkist victory, despite the appearance of a meteorological phenomenon known as a parhelion or sundogs, which created the appearance of three suns in the sky that Edward interpreted as a divine sign, favouring his cause, and later incorporated into Yorkist heraldry. The capture and execution of Owen Tudor, grandfather of the future Henry VII, and father of Jasper Tudor. Following the battle, demonstrated that Lancastrian nobles could no longer expect the traditional protections that had previously limited violence against captured nobility. Edward's arrival in London on February 27, 1461, where enthusiastic crowds greeted him as a deliverer from northern barbarism and Scottish invasion, provided the political foundation for his assumption of royal authority, despite the continued existence of King Henry VI in Lancastrian custody. The deposition of Henry VI and the proclamation of Edward IV as king on March 4, 1461, represented a revolutionary constitutional development that abandoned the fiction of loyal service to a legitimate monarch in favor of open assertion that military victory, genealogical claim, and popular acclamation created legitimate royal authority superior to the rights of an anointed king. The elaborate legal arguments presented to justify Edward's assumption of the throne combined York's genealogical claims, inherited by Edward as his father's heir, with charges that Henry had violated the Act of Accord by permitting his supporters to wage war against recognized royal heirs. The parliamentary recognition of Edward's kingship provided legal formality to what was fundamentally a military and political coup, as the young king's authority rested primarily on his control of London, his possession of military forces capable of defending his claim, and the nobility's recognition that continued support for Henry would result in perpetual civil war. The coronation ceremony that formalized Edward's kingship occurred on June 28, 1461, following his decisive military victory at Towton that had destroyed the main Lancastrian army and secured his practical control over England. The Battle of Towton, fought on March 29, 1461, represented the largest and bloodiest engagement of the entire Wars of the Roses, as Edward's forces, numbering perhaps 30,000 men, confronted a Lancastrian army of similar or greater size in fighting that lasted throughout the day and resulted in casualties estimated at 28,000 dead, an enormous proportion of the forces engaged, and a demonstration of the conflict's transformation into total war between irreconcilable enemies. The battle's location near Towton in Yorkshire, selected by the Lancastrian commanders as they retreated northward from their failure to take London, placed the fighting in territory traditionally loyal to the Lancastrian cause, but also far from their secure bases in the far north. The Yorkist victory, achieved through Edward's tactical competence, the timely arrival of Norfolk's reinforcements that struck the Lancastrian flank at a crucial moment, and the collapse of Lancastrian morale as casualties mounted and retreat routes became congested with fleeing soldiers, destroyed Lancastrian military power in England and forced the survivors to flee to Scotland or into hiding. The enormous casualty figures resulted partly from the traditional fighting, but primarily from the brutal pursuit of fleeing Lancastrian soldiers, as Yorkist forces showed little mercy to defeated enemies whose previous victories had resulted in the execution of captured Yorkist leaders. The deaths of numerous Lancastrian nobles during or after Towton eliminated an entire generation of leaders who had opposed Yorkist ambitions and created political space for the new regime to establish itself without immediate military challenge. The Earl of Northumberland, Lord Dacre, Lord Neville, and numerous other nobles died in the fighting, while others who survived the battle were captured and executed in the immediate aftermath, demonstrating that Edward intended to destroy the Lancastrian military aristocracy rather than seeking reconciliation with defeated enemies. The flight of King Henry, Queen Margaret, and their son Edward of Westminster to Scotland transformed them from the leaders of a powerful military force, controlling substantial English territory, into impoverished exiles, dependent on Scottish and French support for any hope of restoration. Their presence in Scotland created diplomatic complications for Edward's regime, as the Scottish government used its protection of the Lancastrian royal family as leverage in negotiations over border disputes and traditional Anglo-Scottish conflicts. Edward IV's consolidation of power during the early 1460s proceeded through a combination of military operations against remaining Lancastrian strongholds, distribution of forfeited estates to reward loyal supporters, and diplomatic initiatives designed to isolate the Lancastrian cause from foreign assistance. The reduction of Lancastrian castles in Northumberland and Wales required sustained military efforts that absorbed substantial resources and demonstrated that military victory at Towton had not completely eliminated organised resistance to Yorkist authority. Bamborough Castle, Alnwick Castle, and Harlech Castle all held out for extended periods, with their garrisons maintaining loyalty to Henry VI, despite the hopelessness of their strategic position and the absence of relief forces capable of breaking sieges. The eventual surrender of these strongholds between 1461 and 1468 eliminated the last territorial bases for Lancastrian military operations within England, though the castle's resistance demonstrated that some nobles and soldiers maintained commitments to the Lancastrian cause, despite Edward's apparent consolidation of power. Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in May of 1464 represented both a personal romantic choice and a political decision that would have far-reaching consequences for his relationship with the nobility and particularly with Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, whose influence over the young king and whose diplomatic initiatives on Edward's behalf had been crucial to early Yorkist success. The secret nature of the marriage ceremony, which occurred without consultation with the royal council and involved a woman of relatively modest noble background whose family had Lancastrian connections, shocked the nobility when Edward revealed it in September of 1464. Elizabeth's status as a widow with 2 sons from her previous marriage to Sir John Grey, a Lancastrian knight killed at Second Street. Albans fighting against Yorkist forces created additional complications for a match that many nobles viewed as beneath the king's dignity and harmful to English diplomatic interests. The rapid elevation of Elizabeth's numerous relatives to positions of wealth and influence through advantageous marriages to wealthy heirs and heiresses alienated established noble families who resented the Woodvilles' sudden rise and the distribution of valuable marriage prospects to a family many viewed as upstarts. Warwick's particular resentment at the Woodville marriage reflected both personal pique at not being consulted about such an important decision and substantive disagreement about foreign policy, as the Earl had been negotiating a French marriage alliance for Edward that would have secured diplomatic advantages and substantial dowry, while the king was secretly marrying an Englishwoman whose family connections offered no comparable benefits. The contrast between Warwick's vision of English foreign policy, which favoured French alliance against Burgundian aggression, and Edward's ultimate preference for Burgundian friendship against French expansion, created fundamental policy disagreements that the Woodville marriage exacerbated by demonstrating the king's willingness to make major decisions without consulting his most powerful noble supporter. The marriage of Edward's sister Margaret to Charles the Bold of Burgundy in 1468 formalised the Burgundian alliance that Warwick had opposed, creating diplomatic alignment with England's traditional economic partner, while potentially isolating England from French support in conflicts with Scotland or internal rebellions. The complex political manoeuvring that characterised the late 1460s reflected tensions between Edward's assertion of independent royal authority and Warwick's expectation that his crucial role in Edward's acquisition and maintenance of the throne entitled him to dominant influence over royal policy. Warwick's enormous wealth, derived from his inheritance of the Neville family estates and the Beauchamp and Despencer inheritances that came through his wife, made him the wealthiest nobleman in England and provided him with resources to maintain large numbers of armed retainers and to exercise influence throughout the realm. His military reputation, earned through victories at Northampton, the capture of London, and various successful military operations, despite the defeat at Second Street, Albans, made him the most famous English warrior of his generation and earned him continental recognition as the kingmaker, whose support determined English royal succession. The Earl's network of family relationships, which placed his relatives in important military and governmental positions throughout England, created a Neville affinity that rivaled royal power in certain regions and enabled him to mobilise substantial military forces when his interests required armed support. The deterioration of relations between Edward and Warwick accelerated during 1469, when the Earl's attempts to influence royal policy through traditional counsel and persuasion failed to prevent the continued advancement of Woodville family interests or to alter Edward's foreign policy orientation toward Burgundian alliance. Warwick's orchestration of rebellions in Yorkshire, under the leadership of Robin of Redesdale, whose forces claimed to oppose evil councillors and demanded governmental reform while carefully avoiding direct attacks on the king's authority, demonstrated the Earl's willingness to employ armed pressure to achieve political objectives when persuasion failed. The rebel manifesto's specific complaints about Woodville influence and demands for their removal from court indicated clear coordination with Warwick's political objectives, though the Earl maintained official distance from the rebellion while positioning himself to benefit from its success. Edward's advance northward, with military forces intended to suppress the rebellion, placed him in vulnerable position when Warwick revealed his true role by preventing the king's supporters from joining him and effectively trapping the royal forces between the northern rebels and the Earl's own army advancing from the south. The Battle of Edgecote, on July 26, 1469, though not involving the king personally, resulted in the destruction of the royal army under the command of the Earl of Pembroke and Devon, when Robin of Redesdale's forces defeated them in fighting that demonstrated the military competence of rebel troops, vulnerability of royal forces operating without their full complement of noble leadership and resources, the execution of several Woodville family members following the battle, including Earl Rivers and his son John Woodville, eliminated leading figures in the family that Warwick particularly resented and demonstrated the Earl's determination to destroy the influence of those he held responsible for his exclusion from royal favour. Edward's capture by Warwick's forces shortly after Edgecote placed the king in his subjects' custody in a reversal of roles that recalled Henry VI's captivity following Yorkist victories, though Edward's position differed fundamentally because Warwick claimed to act in the king's true interests rather than representing an alternative source of legitimate authority. The Earl's brief period of governmental control during Edward's captivity, in mid-1469, revealed the practical difficulties of maintaining authority while holding a legitimate king prisoner, as nobles and governmental officials proved reluctant to accept orders issued in the king's name, when everyone knew the king lacked freedom to exercise his own will. Warwick's release of Edward in September of 1469 acknowledged the failure of his attempt to govern through a captive king and reflected his recognition that maintaining the pretense of loyal service to Edward impossible when the king clearly opposed his policies and resented his treatment. The superficial reconciliation between king and earl that followed Edward's release satisfied no one and convinced few observers that genuine peace had been achieved, as both parties immediately began preparing for renewed conflict that would determine whether England would be governed by its legitimate king or by the overmighty subject who claimed to protect royal interests while undermining royal authority. Warwick's flight to France in early 1470, following the failure of another rebellion that revealed his continued attempts to coerce Edward through armed force, transformed the most powerful English nobleman into an exile dependent on foreign support for any hope of returning to England with sufficient power to challenge his former protégé. The alliance between Warwick and Queen Margaret, brokered by King Louis XI of France during the summer of 1470, represented an astonishing political reversal that united the Earl who had destroyed Lancastrian power and driven Margaret into exile, with the Queen who had every reason to hate him for the destruction he had wrought on her party, humiliations he had inflicted on her family. Louis's diplomatic skill in reconciling these implacable enemies reflected his determination to use their combined forces to overthrow Edward IV, whose Burgundian alliance threatened French interests, and whose continued rule prevented Louis from exploiting English resources and political divisions to advance French diplomatic objectives. The marriage of Warwick's daughter Anne Neville to Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian heir, formalized the alliance through a dynastic connection that promised eventual union of Warwick and Lancastrian interests, when the young prince inherited his father's throne following the restoration that the alliance intended to accomplish. The ceremony at Angers Cathedral in December of 1470, where Margaret's initial reluctance gave way to political necessity, and she accepted the necessity of alliance with her former enemy, demonstrated the extent to which political calculation could overcome personal hatred when the stakes involved recovery of lost power and restoration of disinherited claims. Warwick's invasion of England in September of 1470 benefited from Edward IV's absence in the north, where he was suppressing Lancastrian uprisings, orchestrated to divide royal forces and create opportunities for the main invasion to succeed without immediate military opposition. The Earl's landing at Dartmouth and his advance through southwestern England gathering supporters demonstrated both his continued popularity among certain segments of English society and the weakness of Edward's governmental control in regions distant from royal power centres. Edward's brother George, Duke of Clarence, who had married Warwick's eldest daughter Isabel in direct violation of Edward's prohibition and had fled to France with his father-in-law, accompanied the invasion force and provided Yorkist legitimacy to what would otherwise have appeared as purely Lancastrian restoration. Clarence's defection from his brother represented a combination of personal ambition, resentment at his exclusion from real power, despite his position as Edward's heir presumptive before the birth of Edward's son, and calculation that Warwick's cause offered better prospects for advancement than continued loyalty to a brother who clearly did not trust him with significant authority. Edward IV's flight from England in October of 1470, undertaken when he realized that Warwick's invasion had succeeded in mobilizing sufficient support to make military resistance impossible with the forces immediately available, represented a stunning reversal of fortune that transformed him from a secure king into a penniless exile seeking refuge in Burgundian territories. The king's narrow escape from forces attempting to capture him, his dangerous sea voyage to the Low Countries with only a handful of loyal companions, and his arrival in Burgundian territories without resources or immediate prospects, demonstrated both the volatility of 15th century English politics and the personal courage that enabled Edward to survive catastrophe and plan for eventual restoration. Charles the Bold's initial reluctance to provide substantial support to his brother-in-law reflected political calculations about the risks of openly supporting a deposed king against a government that France enthusiastically backed, though Charles eventually provided the financial resources and military assistance necessary for Edward to mount an invasion force capable of challenging Warwick's restored regime. The readaptation of Henry VI, accomplished through Warwick's military success and his release of Henry from imprisonment in the Tower of London, where Edward had kept him since 1465, represented an attempt to restore Lancastrian legitimacy while maintaining Warwick's effective control over governmental operations. The contrast between the public ceremonies that displayed Henry as restored king and the reality of his continued mental frailty and political passivity demonstrated the fundamental weakness of the restored regime, which depended entirely on Warwick's military power and political management, rather than on the king's personal authority or governmental competence. Henry's brief return to active kingship between October of 1470 and April of 1471 revealed both the persistent loyalty that some English subjects maintained toward their anointed king, despite his manifest incapacity, and the practical impossibility of operating effective government through a monarch who lacked the mental capacity or political will to make decisions or to provide leadership during crisis. Edward IV's invasion of England in March of 1471, mounted with the military and financial support provided by Charles the Bold, and reinforced by Burgundian mercenaries and English exiles who had fled with Edward or joined him in the Low Countries, benefited from several crucial advantages that enabled him to transform exile into restoration within a matter of months. The strategic decision to land in Yorkshire, claiming initially only to seek recovery of his Duchy of York, rather than immediately asserting his royal title, reduced initial resistance from populations uncertain about supporting rebellion against an anointed king, and enabled Edward to gather forces before declaring his true intentions. The defection of George, Duke of Clarence, from Warwick's cause back to loyalty to his brother, accomplished through negotiations that promised pardon and restoration of Clarence's properties and position, eliminated a potential Yorkist claimant who might have divided Edward's support and provided crucial military reinforcements at a critical moment. Edward's advance toward London, gathering supporters as he marched and demonstrating through his progress that Warwick's regime lacked sufficient popular support to prevent his return, culminated in the city's decision to open its gates to the returning king on April 11th, 1471, providing Edward with control of the capital and custody of Henry VI, whose person he secured to prevent Warwick from using the Lancastrian king's authority against him. The Battle of Barnet, on April 14th, 1471, fought in fog so dense that neither army could clearly see enemy positions or distinguish friend from foe with certainty, resulted in Yorkist victory primarily through the accidental engagement between different sections of the opposing lines that created confusion and ultimately panic among Lancastrian forces. Warwick's death during or immediately after the battle, traditionally occurring as he attempted to reach his horse and escape the field, ended the career of the kingmaker, whose military and political activities had dominated English politics for over a decade, and whose changes of allegiance had determined the fates of multiple kings. The Earl's death in battle, rather than through execution following capture, enabled him to avoid the traitor's death his rebellion had earned, and provided an honourable end that his military reputation deserved, despite his ultimate political failure. The death of Warwick's brother, John Neville, Marquess of Montagu, who had commanded a substantial portion of the Lancastrian army, and whose loyalty to Warwick had survived despite Edward's earlier attempts to secure his allegiance through grants and honours, eliminated another major Neville leader and effectively destroyed the family's political power. The display of Warwick's and Montagu's bodies in St. Paul's Cathedral before burial demonstrated Edward's determination to prove his victory and prevent rumours that his most dangerous enemy had escaped to organise future resistance. The Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4th, 1471, represented the final destruction of Lancastrian military power as Edward's forces, pursuing Queen Margaret's army that had landed in the southwest and attempted to reach Wales, where Lancastrian sympathies remained strong, caught and defeated the Lancastrian forces in fighting that resulted in the death of Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian heir, and the capture of Queen Margaret. The death of the young prince, whether killed during the actual fighting or executed shortly afterward, eliminated the focus of Lancastrian hopes for dynastic continuity and removed the threat that a restored Lancastrian regime might eventually unite the kingdom under Henry VI's heir. The circumstances of Edward of Westminster's death remain controversial, with Yorkist sources claiming he died in battle, while some Lancastrian accounts suggest he was captured and murdered by Edward IV or his brothers, though the political result was identical regardless of the specific mechanism of his demise. The capture of Queen Margaret ended her nearly 2 decades of struggle to preserve her husband's throne and her son's inheritance, transforming her from the formidable leader of Lancastrian forces into a prisoner whose continued existence posed no threat to Yorkist power. The execution of numerous Lancastrian nobles following Tewkesbury, including the Duke of Somerset, who had received Edward's pardon after earlier defection to the Yorkist cause, but had returned to Lancastrian allegiance during the readeption, demonstrated that Edward had abandoned earlier restraint about executing captured enemies, and now intended to eliminate Lancastrian leadership through systematic destruction of their noble supporters. The death of Henry VI on May 21st, 1471, occurring during the night following Edward IV's triumphant return to London after the victory at Tewkesbury, officially resulted from melancholy and grief at learning of his son's death, though contemporary suspicions and subsequent historical analysis have generally concluded that Henry was murdered on Edward's orders to eliminate the Lancastrian figurehead around whom future rebellions might organise. The timing of Henry's death, so convenient for Yorkist interests, and occurring just as Edward achieved complete military victory, combined with the absence of any apparent illness before his sudden demise, supported conclusions that the official explanation concealed political murder disguised as natural death. Henry's burial at Chertsey Abbey without the royal honours typically accorded to deceased monarchs reflected Edward's determination to minimise Henry's historical significance and to discourage popular veneration that might develop around a king who had suffered decades of captivity and degradation. The later reports of miracles occurring at Henry's tomb and the development of popular cults surrounding his memory demonstrated that Edward's attempts to diminish Henry's historical significance had failed, and that many English subjects continued to regard him as a legitimate king who had been wrongfully deposed and murdered by usurpers. Edward IV's second reign, from 1471 until his death in 1483, represented a period of relative stability during which the king consolidated his authority, eliminated potential threats to his dynasty, and established governmental and financial systems that enabled him to rule without the constant parliamentary taxation that had weakened his predecessor's authority. The elimination of Lancastrian leadership through the deaths of Henry VI, Edward of Westminster, and numerous noble supporters at Tewkesbury and its aftermath, combined with Queen Margaret's captivity and eventual ransom by Louis XI in 1475, meant that no plausible Lancastrian claimant remained to challenge Yorkist authority. The minor exceptions to Lancastrian extinction included Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, who had fled to Brittany and whose claim to the throne through his mother, Margaret Beaufort's descent from John of Gaunt's legitimised bastards, appeared extremely tenuous, given the legal restrictions on Beaufort's succession, established when their legitimisation had occurred. Edward's attempts to secure Henry Tudor's return to England through diplomatic pressure on Breton authorities demonstrated his awareness that even remote claimants might become dangerous if circumstances created opportunities for them to mobilise opposition to Yorkist rule. The execution of George, Duke of Clarence, in February of 1478, marked the most controversial action of Edward's second reign, as the king ordered the death of his own brother, following Clarence's conviction for treason, in proceedings that revealed the Duke's continued political unreliability and his dangerous claims to superior genealogical right to the Prussian throne compared to Edward's children by Elizabeth Woodville. Clarence's erratic behaviour following the death of his wife Isabel in 1476, including his violent response to the execution of one of his wife's attendants whom he accused of poisoning the Duchess, his public questioning of Edward's legitimacy through suggestions that Edward was not truly the son of Richard, Duke of York, and his apparent efforts to build independent power base that might support a future coup, convinced Edward that his brother posed unacceptable risks to political stability and dynastic security. The private execution method, traditionally identified as drowning in a butt of Malmsey wine, though the actual mechanism remains uncertain, spared Clarence the public humiliation of traitor's death, while accomplishing the political objective of eliminating a potential focus for noble opposition to Edward's rule. The execution's impact on Edward's relationship with his youngest brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, whose loyalty to Edward had never wavered, but who reportedly opposed Clarence's execution, and whose later actions might have reflected resentment at his brother's death, created dynamics that would influence the succession crisis following Edward's unexpected death 5 years later. Edward's foreign policy during the 1470s balanced English interests between France and Burgundy, while extracting financial benefits through diplomatic maneuvers that demonstrated the king's sophisticated understanding of continental politics and his determination to secure revenue sources that would reduce his dependence on parliamentary grants. The Treaty of Picquigny in 1475, which ended Edward's invasion of France before any significant fighting occurred, secured an immediate payment of 75,000 crowns and an annual pension of 50,000 crowns from Louis XI, in exchange for Edward's withdrawal from France and his abandonment of Burgundian alliance. The treaty's financial provisions provided Edward with reliable income that supplemented revenues from royal estates, custom duties, and other sources, enabling him to operate government without frequent parliaments that might have limited royal authority or demanded policy concessions in exchange for taxation grants. The treaty's betrayal of Burgundian alliance, accomplished while Charles the Bold's forces were actively engaged with Louis's armies, and while Charles had reasonable expectations of English military support, damaged Edward's reputation for reliability and contributed to the deterioration of Anglo-Burgundian relations that would create complications during the succession crisis following Edward's death. The commercial policies that Edward pursued during the 1470s, including active personal involvement in trading ventures that utilized royal ships and factors to engage in wool export and other profitable commerce, generated substantial income that enhanced royal financial independence while creating controversy about the propriety of royal participation in mercantile activities traditionally reserved for merchant classes. Edward's understanding of commercial operations and his willingness to exploit royal resources and privileges for profit demonstrated practical financial sense that strengthened crown finances but offended some nobles who viewed such activities as beneath royal dignity. The king's efforts to recover royal estates that had been granted away during his first reign or during periods of Lancastrian rule, combined with more efficient exploitation of remaining crown lands through improved estate management, generated increased revenues that reduced the gap between governmental expenditure and income. The development of more systematic royal financial administration, including better accounting procedures and more aggressive collection of debts owed to the crown, reflected Edward's determination to avoid the financial crises that had weakened previous kings and forced them to make political concessions to secure necessary funding. Edward's physical deterioration during the early 1480s, marked by increasing weight and declining health that suggested possible diabetes or other metabolic disorders, reduced his previous energy and effectiveness while creating awareness of mortality that should have prompted clearer succession arrangements than the king actually established. Edward's death on April 9, 1483, at the age of 40, shocked contemporaries who had not recognized the severity of his illness and who expected that he would live long enough for his son, Edward, Prince of Wales, to reach adulthood and assume personal rule without extended regency that might create political instability. The king's deathbed designation of his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as protector of the realm during his son's minority, represented Edward's judgment that Richard's loyalty and administrative competence qualified him to manage government until the young Edward V achieved the age necessary for independent rule. However, Edward's failure to remove the Woodville family from positions controlling his son's household and education, combined with his apparent assumption that Richard and the Woodvilles would cooperate in governing during the minority, demonstrated remarkable political naivety given the long history of hostility between Gloucester and the Queen's family. The immediate aftermath of Edward IV's death revealed the political tensions that had been suppressed during the late king's lifetime, but now exploded into open conflict over control of the young Edward V, determination of who would exercise power during his minority. The Woodville family's efforts to secure their position through rapid coronation of the 12-year-old king before Richard could assert his protectorate authority, combined with their control of the prince's person and household as he travelled from Ludlow to London for coronation, created the conditions for political confrontation that Richard resolved through military action rather than negotiation. Richard's interception of Edward V at Stony Stratford on April 30th, 1483, where he arrested Earl Rivers and other Woodville associates who accompanied the young king, demonstrated his determination to assert protectorate authority and to prevent Woodville domination of the minority government. The execution of Rivers and the other arrested Woodvilles on charges of plotting against the protector, carried out in June without legal trial, eliminated leading members of the Queen's family and demonstrated Richard's willingness to employ violence against those he perceived as threats to his authority or the kingdom's welfare. Queen Elizabeth Woodville's flight into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her younger son Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters from her marriage to Edward IV reflected her recognition that Richard's seizure of power threatened her family's position and possibly their lives. The Queen's attempts to mobilize support for resistance to Richard's protectorate failed because few nobles were willing to risk civil war to defend Woodville interests against the late king's brother, who possessed both legal claim to the protectorate and military forces capable of crushing opposition. Richard's governance as protector during May and early June of 1483 appeared to confirm expectations that he would rule competently during his nephew's minority while respecting the young king's rights and preparing for his eventual coronation and assumption of personal power. The protector's confirmation of noble titles and positions, his consultations with the royal council, and his preparations for Edward V's coronation all suggested that the political crisis created by Edward IV's death was resolving peacefully through Richard's effective leadership. The dramatic political revolution that occurred in mid-June 1483, when Richard suddenly arrested Lord Hastings and executed him without trial on charges of plotting against the protector, initiated a sequence of events that transformed Richard from protector into king within 3 weeks. The specific accusations against Hastings, which supposedly involved plotting with the Woodvilles to assassinate Richard and seize control of government, remain controversial, with some historians accepting that a genuine plot existed, while others interpret the charges as fabrications designed to eliminate a powerful noble whose loyalty to Edward V might have prevented Richard's usurpation. The execution's summary nature, occurring immediately after Hastings's arrest during a council meeting, without legal proceedings or opportunity for defense, shocked contemporaries and created suspicions about Richard's motives and methods that would color perceptions of his subsequent actions. The revelation of the pre-contract claim, which alleged that Edward IV had been legally married to Eleanor Butler before his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, and therefore that all children of the Woodville marriage were illegitimate bastards, ineligible for the throne, provided the legal foundation for Richard's claim to the crown, but convinced few observers that the claim represented genuine discovery rather than invented justification for predetermined usurpation. The pre-contract claim rested on allegations that Edward had contracted a legally binding marriage with Eleanor Butler, daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury, before his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, making the later marriage bigamous and invalid. The claim's principal advocate was Robert Stillington, Bishop of Bath and Wells, who supposedly had personal knowledge of the earlier marriage through his involvement in the ceremony or his confession from one of the parties. The absence of any contemporary evidence for the pre-contract before June of 1483, combined with the convenient timing of its revelation, just as Richard needed legal justification for setting aside his nephew's rights, created widespread skepticism about the claim's validity. The theological and legal arguments supporting the pre-contract's effect on Edward V's legitimacy required accepting that a clandestine marriage ceremony, conducted without witnesses or publication, created binding obligations equivalent to formal public marriage, a position that had support in canon law but contradicted common understanding of marriage requirements. The parliamentary recognition of the pre-contract claim through titulus regius, the statute that legitimized Richard's kingship, provided legal formality to accusations that many contemporaries viewed as transparent frauds designed to justify usurpation. Richard III's coronation on July 6, 1483, represented the formal assumption of royal authority that the pre-contract allegations and parliamentary recognition had legally enabled, though the ceremony's magnificence could not disguise the revolutionary nature of events that had transformed a protector into a king within 10 weeks of his brother's death. The coronation of Richard's wife, Anne Neville, as Queen Consort, whose previous marriage to Edward of Westminster had made her briefly Lancastrian heir's wife before his death at Tewkesbury, demonstrated the complete reversal of political fortunes that had characterized the Wars of the Roses. The disappearance of Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, who had been moved to the Tower of London, ostensibly for Edward's protection and preparation for coronation, but who were never seen publicly after Richard's assumption of the throne, created immediately suspicions about their fate that would haunt Richard's reign and contribute to the perception that he had murdered his nephews to secure his usurped throne. The prince's exact fate remains one of English history's most debated mysteries, with contemporary and near-contemporary sources generally assuming that Richard had them killed, but providing no reliable evidence about the timing, method, or circumstances of their deaths. Buckingham's rebellion in October of 1483, led by Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, who had been Richard's crucial ally during the usurpation, but who now turned against the king he had helped create, represented the first serious challenge to Richard's authority and demonstrated the weakness of support for a regime founded on usurpation and suspected child murder. Buckingham's motives for rebellion remain unclear, with various explanations including personal ambition for the throne based on his own descent from Edward III, moral revulsion at the prince's murder if he had not previously known of Richard's intentions, or manipulation by Margaret Beaufort and other Lancastrian conspirators who convinced him to support Henry Tudor's claim. The rebellion's comprehensive failure, resulting from flooding that prevented Buckingham's Welsh forces from crossing the Severn River to join with southern rebels, the collapse of rebel organisation when royal forces advanced against scattered uprising, and the absence of Henry Tudor's invasion fleet, which had been scattered by storms, demonstrated both Richard's military competence in suppressing opposition and the rebels' inadequate preparation for challenging an anointed king, supported by the administrative and military resources of royal government. Buckingham's capture and execution on November 2nd, 1483, eliminated a major noble whose genealogical claims and political connections might have provided continuing focus for opposition to Richard's rule. Henry Tudor's emergence as the alternative claimant to Richard's throne represented the unexpected consequence of the Yorkist usurpation, as the destruction of both Lancastrian and Yorkist royal lines through the deaths of Henry VI, Edward of Westminster, Edward IV's sons, and Clarence created political space for a claimant whose genealogical credentials appeared extremely weak, but whose position, as the only available alternative to Richard, gave him political significance disproportionate to his actual claim. Henry's descent through his mother Margaret Beaufort from John of Gaunt's legitimised children by Catherine Swynford had been explicitly excluded from royal succession when Parliament legitimised the Beauforts in the 1390s, making his claim legally questionable, even without considering the general principle that descent through exclusively female lines had never established rights to English throne. However, the absence of other claimants and the growing perception that Richard had obtained the throne through usurpation and murder created political conditions where Henry's weak claim became preferable to Richard's stronger legal position but morally tainted kingship. The development of a Lancastrian Yorkist coalition supporting Henry Tudor's claim demonstrated the extent to which Richard's usurpation had alienated both traditional Lancastrian supporters and Yorkist nobles, whose loyalty to Edward IV's memory made them unwilling to accept his brother's seizure of the throne from Edward's sons. The betrothal of Henry Tudor to Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, arranged through negotiations between Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville, promised to unite the competing dynastic claims through marriage and to heal the divisions that had torn England for 30 years. The symbolic power of this proposed union, combining the Lancastrian heir with the Yorkist heiress in a marriage that would merge the rival houses and create a new dynasty, transcending old divisions, provided a compelling vision that attracted support from nobles weary of continued conflict and seeking permanent resolution of succession disputes. The practical reality that Elizabeth of York's claim to the throne in her own right, based on her position as Edward IV's eldest child, was at least as strong as Henry's claim, created complications that the alliance carefully avoided addressing through emphasis that Elizabeth's value derived from her position as Yorkist heiress, who would legitimise Henry's Lancastrian claim rather than from any independent rights she might possess. Richard III's governance during his brief reign demonstrated administrative competence and genuine concern for justice and legal reform that contrasted with the moral problems created by his usurpation and the suspicions surrounding his nephew's disappearance. The king's progress through the Midlands and North during the summer of 1483, during which he held public audiences, dispensed justice, and demonstrated concern for his subjects' welfare, represented attempts to build popular support and to establish his kingship on foundations beyond the parliamentary statute that had legitimised his accession. Richard's particular attention to northern England, where his previous service as Edward IV's lieutenant had established relationships with local nobility and gentry, reflected both genuine affection for the region and practical recognition that northern support would be crucial for maintaining his throne against challenges from Lancastrian exiles and disaffected Yorkists. The king's creation of the Council of the North as a permanent institution for governing the northern counties demonstrated his understanding of regional administration's importance and his commitment to providing effective government throughout the realm. The death of Richard's son, Edward of Middleham, in April of 1484, leaving the king without a legitimate heir and creating succession uncertainty that undermined political stability, represented a personal catastrophe that also had profound political implications for a regime whose legitimacy already faced serious questions. Richard's designation of John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, his nephew through his sister Elizabeth's marriage to the Duke of Suffolk, as his heir presumptive, provided temporary solution to the succession problem. but failed to create the sense of dynastic security that a son would have provided. The absence of other children from Richard's marriage to Anne Neville, despite years of wedlock, raised questions about the king's ability to father legitimate heirs and created speculation about whether divine judgment was preventing a usurper from establishing a dynasty. Anne Neville's death in March of 1485, possibly from tuberculosis, eliminated Richard's queen and created additional succession complications, as the king's consideration of remarriage to his niece Elizabeth of York, which would have eliminated Henry Tudor's planned marriage alliance, created scandal and required Richard to publicly deny any such intention. Henry Tudor's invasion of England in August of 1485, launched from France with limited military forces that included French mercenaries, English exiles, and Welsh supporters recruited during his landing in Pembrokeshire, represented a desperate gamble by a claimant whose genealogical credentials remained weak, but whose political position as the alternative to Richard had attracted substantial support from disaffected elements of English nobility, gentry. Henry's landing at Mill Bay near Dale on August 7th, 1485, placed him in Wales, where Tudor family connections and Welsh enthusiasm for a claimant of Welsh descent promised recruitment opportunities and sympathetic populations that might shelter his forces as they advanced toward confrontation with Richard's royal army. The route of Henry's march through Wales toward the English Midlands demonstrated careful planning, designed to maximize recruitment while avoiding premature confrontation with royal forces that possessed superior numbers. Equipment. The crucial question facing both sides was whether the Stanley family, whose enormous military resources and strategic position in northwestern England made them capable of determining the battle's outcome, would support Richard, join Henry, or remain neutral while awaiting the battle's development. Thomas, Lord Stanley, and his brother, Sir William Stanley, controlled military forces, numbering in the thousands through their positions as leading nobles in Lancashire and Cheshire, and through the complex network of family relationships and feudal obligations that enabled them to mobilize substantial armies. Richard's possession of Lord Stanley's son, George, Lord Strange, as a hostage who faced execution if Stanley betrayed the king, should have guaranteed the family's loyalty, or at least their neutrality. But the Stanleys' calculation that Henry's victory offered better prospects than Richard's continued rule led them to accept the risk to Strange's life in exchange for the possibility of decisive influence over England's political future. The Stanleys' communications with Henry Tudor during his march through Wales, which provided intelligence about Richard's movements and promises of support while maintaining official neutrality, demonstrated their sophisticated political maneuvering designed to maximize their advantage, regardless of battle's outcome. The decision to position their forces on the battlefield in locations that enabled them to join either side, depending on how the fighting developed, reflected their determination to back the winner, while retaining flexibility until the outcome became clear. The Battle of Bosworth Field, on August 22nd, 1485, fought near Market Bosworth in Leicestershire, resulted in the death of Richard III and the accession of Henry Tudor as Henry VII through a combination of military action and political betrayal that ended the Yorkist dynasty and initiated the Tudor period of English history. The battle's early phases saw Richard's larger army positioned on Ambion Hill with artillery and archers deployed to maximum advantage, successfully resisting Henry Tudor's initial attacks and inflicting casualties on the rebel forces that suggested royal victory, remained possible despite the numerical inferiority created by the Stanleys' refusal to commit their raids forces to either side. Richard's decision to personally lead a cavalry charge directly at Henry Tudor, whom he had identified on the battlefield, accompanied by a small bodyguard, represented either reckless desperation or calculated military judgment that killing the rebel claimant would end the battle immediately and eliminate the threat to his throne. The king's charge nearly succeeded in reaching Henry, and killing him before superior numbers overwhelmed the royal group. But Sir William Stanley's intervention, with his forces at the crucial moment, attacking Richard's men from the flank and routing them, ensured the king's death and Henry's survival. Richard III's death in the fighting, killed by multiple wounds inflicted by soldiers who surrounded and overwhelmed him after his horse became mired, and he fell to the ground, made him the last English king to die in battle and ended the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England since Henry II's accession in 1154. The treatment of Richard's body following the battle, stripped naked and displayed publicly in Leicester before burial in the Grey Friars Church, demonstrated the victor's determination to prove his death and prevent any rumours that he had escaped to organise future resistance. The discovery of Richard's remains in 2012 during archaeological excavations beneath a Leicester car park, identified through DNA analysis and showing evidence of the battle wounds described in contemporary accounts, provided scientific confirmation of the burial location and enabled detailed physical analysis of the king, whose brief reign had transformed English succession and whose reputation had been devastated by Tudor propaganda. Henry Tudor's coronation as Henry VII on October 30th, 1485, represented the formal establishment of a new dynasty whose legitimacy rested on the questionable foundations of genealogical claims through female descent from legitimized bastards, parliamentary recognition secured after military victory, and the promise of dynastic union through marriage to the Yorkist heiress Elizabeth of York. The consolidation of Henry VII's authority during the late 1480s required both military suppression of Yorkist resistance and political maneuvering, designed to establish his dynasty's legitimacy, while preventing challenges from genealogically superior claimants. Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York in January of 1486, delayed until after his coronation, to emphasize that he claimed the throne in his own right, rather than through his wife's superior Yorkist claim, fulfilled his pledge to unite the competing dynasties while creating a union that promised to end the conflicts that had devastated England for 3 decades. The birth of Arthur, Prince of Wales, in September of 1486, provided the new dynasty with an heir who combined both Lancastrian and Yorkist blood, and whose very name recalled legendary British kingship that predated the Norman conquest and the French, dynasties that had torn England apart. However, the survival of potential Yorkist claimants, including Edward, Earl of Warwick, the young son of the executed Duke of Clarence, and John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, whom Richard III had designated as his heir, created ongoing threats to Tudor security that would require constant vigilance and occasional violence to neutralize. The Lambert-Simnel imposture of 1487, which claimed that a 10-year-old boy of obscure origins was actually Edward, Earl of Warwick, escaped from the Tower of London where Henry held him prisoner, demonstrated both the appeal of Yorkist restoration to nobles who resented Tudor usurpation and the vulnerability of a regime whose legitimacy many questioned. The conspiracy's leadership by John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, who fled England to join the Burgundian court and organized an invasion force with support from Margaret of Burgundy, Edward IV's sister, who maintained fierce hatred of Henry Tudor and determination to restore her family to the throne, provided genuine Yorkist credentials that made the imposture more threatening than it would have been as a simple fraud. The invasion force's landing in Ireland, where the boy was crowned as Edward VI in Dublin despite the manifest absurdity of his claims, reflected Irish willingness to support any challenge to English authority and provided the conspiracy with a territorial base from which to launch operations against Henry's regime. Lincoln's landing in England, with an army of German mercenaries provided by Margaret of Burgundy, combined with Irish troops and English Yorkist sympathizers, created a military force that required Henry to mobilize the full resources of royal government to defeat. The Battle of Stokefield on June 16, 1487, represented the last major military engagement of the Wars of the Roses, as Henry VII's royal army confronted the Yorkist invasion force in fighting that demonstrated both the continuing appeal of Yorkist claims and the military superiority of Tudor forces, supported by the kingdom's governmental resources. The battle's outcome, resulting in decisive royal victory and the deaths of Lincoln, Lord Lovell, and thousands of German and Irish soldiers, eliminated the principal Yorkist military leadership and demonstrated that armed challenges to Tudor authority would be crushed through superior force. Lambert-Simnel's capture and Henry's decision to spare his life. Instead, employing him in royal kitchens as a demonstration that he posed no genuine threat to the regime, showed both the king's mercy and his sophisticated understanding of propaganda value in humiliating the impostor rather than creating a martyr through execution. The conspiracy's failure, despite substantial foreign support and genuine noble leadership, indicated that most English nobles preferred stability under Tudor rule to the uncertainties of renewed civil war on behalf of questionable claimants. The Perkin-Warbeck imposture that emerged in 1491 presented a more sophisticated and longer-lasting challenge to Tudor security, as the pretender claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of Edward IV's sons who had disappeared in the Tower of London in 1483, and whose fate remained officially unknown despite widespread assumptions of murder. Warbeck's physical appearance, manners, and knowledge of Yorkist court life convinced numerous foreign rulers and some English nobles that he might genuinely be the escaped prince, or at minimum that he could serve as useful tool for diplomatic pressure against Henry VII. The support that Warbeck received from James IV of Scotland, who provided him with military assistance and a noble bride through his marriage to Lady Catherine Gordon, daughter of the Earl of Huntly, created a genuine military threat that required substantial English defensive preparations along the Scottish border. The Pretender's various invasion attempts between 1495 and 1497, launched from Scotland and Ireland with forces that never achieved sufficient size to challenge royal authority effectively, demonstrated both his persistence and the fundamental weakness of his position without substantial English noble support. Henry VII's eventual capture of Perkin-Warbeck in 1497 and his execution in 1499, following an escape attempt from the Tower of London that may have been deliberately facilitated to provide justification for executing a prisoner whose continued existence created diplomatic complications, eliminated the most persistent challenge to Tudor legitimacy during Henry's reign. The execution of Edward, Earl of Warwick, at the same time as Warbeck's execution, removed the last Plantagenet heir whose genealogical claims might have attracted support from nobles seeking alternatives to Tudor rule, though the judicial murder of a mentally disabled young man, whose only crime was his royal blood, demonstrated the ruthlessness that underlay Henry's carefully constructed image as a peace-bringing monarch. The elimination of these final threats to dynasty security enabled Henry to focus on consolidating royal authority through administrative reforms, financial policies, and diplomatic initiatives that would establish the foundations for Tudor governance throughout the 16th century. The resolution of the succession crisis through the survival of Henry VII's dynasty and the failure of various Yorkist claimants and pretenders to generate sufficient support for restoration established the Tudor monarchy's legitimacy through the test of sustained possession and successful governance, rather than through superior genealogical claims or theoretical legal arguments. The marriage of Henry's son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon in 1499 created a Spanish alliance that enhanced English diplomatic prestige and promised to establish the Tudor dynasty within European royal networks through matrimonial connections. Arthur's premature death in 1502 and the subsequent betrothal of his younger brother Henry to Catherine preserved the Spanish alliance while creating succession arrangements that would eventually produce Henry VIII, whose reign would transform English religious life and complete the Tudor dynasty's establishment as one of Europe's major ruling houses. The stability that England achieved during Henry VII's reign, compared to the chaos of the Wars of the Roses period, demonstrated that the sustained bloodshed and political conflict had finally exhausted the nobility's appetite for armed resistance to established authority, creating conditions where even a dynasty founded on questionable genealogical claims could achieve secure possession through competent governance and the ruthless elimination of potential rivals. The transformation of historical memory regarding the Wars of the Roses began during the Tudor period itself, as official historians and propagandists constructed narratives that justified Tudor claims to the throne while vilifying previous dynasties whose conflicts had devastated England. Polydore Virgil's Anglica Historia, commissioned by Henry VII, and presenting the Tudor accession as divine providence, ending decades of conflict through the union of Lancastrian and Yorkist lines, established interpretive frameworks that influenced subsequent historical understanding for centuries. The portrayal of Richard III as a deformed tyrant who murdered his nephews, and whose death at Bosworth represented divine judgment on usurpation and evil counsellors, reached its most influential form in William Shakespeare's historical plays, which transformed complex political and military conflicts into morality tales about the consequences of illegitimate ambition and the restoration of rightful authority. The Tudor myth of the Wars of the Roses, which emphasized the period's chaos and suffering while presenting Tudor rule as providential resolution that brought peace and unity to a fractured realm, served clear political purposes in legitimizing a dynasty whose actual claims to the throne remained legally questionable, but whose military success and sustained governance had created prescriptive right through long possession. The modern scholarly reassessment of the Wars of the Roses has moved beyond Tudor propaganda to examine the complex political, social, and economic factors that contributed to the conflicts, while recognizing that the traditional narrative of continuous warfare misrepresents a period characterized by extended intervals of peace, interrupted by brief but intense military campaigns. The recognition that the wars involved relatively small forces fighting limited campaigns, rather than total mobilization of English military resources, has modified earlier interpretations that portrayed the period as one of comprehensive social breakdown and widespread destruction. The acknowledgement that most of the English population continued their normal economic and social activities throughout the period, with military operations affecting primarily the nobility and their armed retainers, rather than systematically disrupting agricultural production or commercial activities, has created more nuanced understanding of how medieval societies managed to maintain basic social and economic functions despite political instability at the highest levels. The examination of regional variations in the conflict's impact has revealed that certain areas, particularly the North and the Welsh Marches, experienced more intensive military operations and political disruption than southeastern England, where royal authority and commercial prosperity remained relatively stable despite changes in dynastic control. The genealogical complexity that characterized competing claims to the English throne reflected the fundamental problem created by Edward III's fertility and the absence of clear primogeniture rules that could definitively resolve disputes about rightful succession when descent occurred through female lines, or when different branches of the royal family possessed competing claims of comparable strength. The Mortimer claim, through Lionel of Antwerp's daughter, possessed theoretical superiority based on primogeniture principles that prioritized seniority of descent over gender considerations. But the practical reality that the Lancastrian dynasty had established itself through 3 generations of kings created prescriptive right that many contemporaries found more compelling than abstract genealogical arguments. The Yorkist combination of the Mortimer claim through Anne Mortimer's marriage to Richard of York, with York's own descent from Edmund of Langley, created genealogical position that exceeded Lancastrian claims, according to strict primogeniture analysis. But the Yorkist resort to armed resistance against an anointed king undermined their own constitutional arguments about the sanctity of legitimate succession. The ultimate resolution of these competing claims, through Henry Tudor's military victory and subsequent marriage to Elizabeth of York, which united Lancastrian and Yorkist lines while establishing a new dynasty that could claim descent from both competing houses, demonstrated that genealogical arguments ultimately mattered less than military success and sustained governmental competence in establishing legitimate royal authority. The role of individual personalities in shaping the conflict's development and resolution deserves recognition alongside the structural factors involving genealogical claims, noble factionalism, and governmental weakness. Henry VI's manifest incapacity for effective kingship created the power vacuum that enabled competing noble factions to pursue their interests without the restraint that strong royal leadership might have imposed. While his periodic mental collapse eliminated even the nominal authority of royal presence that might have moderated political conflicts, Margaret of Anjou's forceful personality and determined defense of her son's inheritance provided crucial leadership for the Lancastrian cause during periods when Henry's incapacity prevented him from exercising any governmental function. though her French origins and identification with failed French policies made her a polarizing figure whose effectiveness was limited by the hostility she generated among English nobles and populations. Edward IV's military competence, political skills, and physical presence enabled him to establish and maintain Yorkist authority despite the questionable legitimacy of his initial seizure of power. Though his unexpected death at age 40 created succession crisis that his governmental arrangements proved inadequate to manage peacefully. Richard III's usurpation, whether motivated by genuine concern about Woodville domination of his nephew's minority or by personal ambition for the throne, demonstrated how individual decisions could transform political situations and create opportunities for challenges that structural conditions alone might not have generated. The military aspects of the Wars of the Roses revealed both continuities with earlier medieval warfare and innovations that reflected changing technology and tactical thinking during the 15th century. The battles typically involved relatively small forces by European standards, with armies numbering in the thousands, or occasionally the tens of thousands, rather than the massive hosts that continental warfare sometimes mobilized, reflecting England's smaller population and the limited resources that noble factions could mobilize for military operations. The tactical systems employed at battles like Towton, Barnet, and Bosworth combined traditional elements of medieval warfare, including cavalry charges and hand-to-hand combat between armored men-at-arms, with increasing use of archery and early firearms that demonstrated the gradual evolution of military technology. The importance of artillery in siege operations, and occasionally in field battles, indicated growing recognition of gunpowder weapons' potential, though the technology remained insufficiently developed to revolutionize battlefield tactics as it would in subsequent centuries. The crucial role of political loyalty and noble betrayals in determining battle outcomes, as demonstrated by Grey of Ruthin's defection at Northampton and the Stanleys' intervention at Bosworth, revealed that military success in civil wars depended as much on political maneuvering and negotiation as on tactical competence and battlefield courage. The social and economic impacts of the Wars of the Roses on English society remain subjects of historical debate, with traditional interpretations emphasizing the destructive effects of sustained political instability, contrasting with revisionist analyses that stress the conflict's limited direct impact on most of the population. The concentration of military operations in specific regions during brief campaigning seasons, combined with the relatively small size of armies involved and the limited duration of actual fighting, meant that most English counties experienced only occasional disruption from military operations, rather than sustained warfare that systematically destroyed economic infrastructure or agricultural productivity. The nobility's disproportionate suffering of casualties through battlefield deaths and political executions contrasted with the relatively limited impact on common populations, who continued their agricultural and commercial activities throughout the period, despite changes in political leadership and periodic military operations in their regions. The economic recovery and commercial expansion that characterized late 15th century England suggested that even several decades of political instability had not fundamentally damaged the kingdom's productive capacity or its ability to engage in profitable domestic and international commerce. The maintenance of legal and administrative systems throughout the period, with courts continuing to function and governmental institutions maintaining basic operations despite changes in royal leadership, demonstrated the resilience of English institutional structures and their capacity to provide continuity despite political upheaval at the highest levels. The religious dimensions of the Wars of the Roses, while less prominent than the political and military aspects, reflected the complex relationship between church institutions and royal authority during a period when ecclesiastical figures participated in governmental operations, while their spiritual authority provided legitimacy to competing dynastic claims. The bishops and abbots who served in royal councils and administrative positions brought expertise in law, finance, and diplomacy that proved valuable for governmental operations, though their involvement in partisan political activities sometimes compromised their spiritual authority and created awkward situations when regime changes required them to transfer allegiance to new rulers. The Church's role in coronation ceremonies, which transformed successful military commanders into anointed kings through sacred rituals that claimed divine sanction for their rule, provided crucial legitimacy that distinguished crowned monarchs from mere military strongmen, though the willingness of ecclesiastical authorities to coronate multiple competing claimants undermined claims that coronation represented divine designation of rightful rulers. The development of political cults around murdered or deposed kings, particularly Henry VI, whose reported miracles and popular veneration suggested that many English subjects regarded him as a martyred saint, demonstrated that religious sentiment could create alternative sources of legitimacy that challenged official Tudor narratives about rightful succession and divine providence. The cultural and literary legacy of the Wars of the Roses extended far beyond the immediate political and military events to influence English literature, historical writing, and political thought for centuries after the conflicts ended. The chronicle traditions that developed during and immediately after the wars, including the works of writers with access to eyewitness accounts and official documents, provided source materials that subsequent historians and literary figures would mine for dramatic narratives and historical interpretations. The Tudor historians' transformation of complex political and military conflicts into morality tales about the dangers of civil war and the benefits of strong monarchical authority served immediate political purposes, while establishing interpretive frameworks that influenced historical understanding for generations. Shakespeare's history plays, which drew upon Tudor historical narratives while adding dramatic elements and psychological complexity to historical figures, created literary portrayals that became more influential than actual historical evidence in shaping popular understanding of the period's events and personalities. The enduring fascination with figures like Richard III, whose portrayal as a villainous hunchback in Shakespeare's play contradicted both contemporary physical descriptions and modern archaeological evidence about his actual appearance, demonstrated how literary representations could overwhelm historical accuracy in creating cultural memory. The constitutional significance of the Wars of the Roses for English political development involved both immediate consequences in terms of changed succession practices and long-term implications for the relationship between royal authority and noble power. The demonstration that military force could determine royal succession, despite genealogical claims or legal arguments, established precedents that would influence subsequent English political crises, though the fundamental acceptance of hereditary monarchy as the legitimate basis for royal authority meant that successful usurpers still needed to claim some genealogical connection to previous rulers rather than justifying their power purely through military success. The weakening of the high nobility through battlefield deaths, political executions, and attainders that confiscated estates and destroyed family positions created opportunities for the Tudor monarchy to assert greater royal authority over a diminished aristocracy whose military resources and political independence had been substantially reduced. The development of new nobility through the elevation of loyal supporters to replace attainted families created a peerage more dependent on royal favour and less capable of mounting armed resistance to royal authority than the great noble, houses whose independent power bases had enabled them to challenge weak kings during the 15th century. The Wars of the Roses' place in the broader context of late medieval European political development revealed both England's distinctiveness and its similarities to continental patterns of dynastic conflict and noble factionalism. The French Civil War between Armagnacs and Burgundians during the early 15th century, which had facilitated English military success during Henry V's campaigns, demonstrated that dynastic disputes and noble factionalism affected continental monarchies as severely as England, though France's eventual recovery under strong royal leadership provided a model that English monarchs would eventually follow. The Spanish kingdom's resolution of succession disputes through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, which united Aragon and Castile while establishing the foundation for Spanish imperial expansion, offered an alternative pattern of dynastic consolidation through matrimonial alliance rather than extended military conflict. The Holy Roman Empire's persistent political fragmentation and the electoral nature of imperial succession created different constitutional dynamics from England's hereditary monarchy though the principle that effective power often mattered more than theoretical legal rights applied in both contexts. The Italian peninsula's division among competing city-states, princely dynasties, and foreign powers demonstrated even more extreme political fragmentation than England experienced, suggesting that the Wars of the Roses, while destructive, represented relatively contained conflicts compared to the chaos that affected regions lacking effective centralized authority. The memory and commemoration of the Wars of the Roses in subsequent English history reflected changing political contexts and historical interpretations that transformed the period's significance for different generations. The Tudor emphasis on the wars as cautionary tale about the dangers of civil conflict and the benefits of strong monarchical authority served the dynasty's political interests while establishing interpretive frameworks that influenced historical understanding throughout the early modern period. The Stuart monarchs' invocation of similar themes during the 17th century English Civil War, when royalist propagandists portrayed parliamentary resistance as repetition of the chaos and bloodshed that had characterized the 15th century, demonstrated the continuing political utility of Wars of the Roses narratives for monarchs seeking to delegitimize opposition to royal authority. The romantic 19th century interest in medieval chivalry and noble conflict transformed the Wars of the Roses into subject matter for historical novels and artistic representations that emphasized the period's dramatic potential while often distorting its historical reality to conform to Victorian aesthetic and moral preferences. The modern scholarly approaches that emphasize social and economic analysis alongside traditional political and military history created more complex understanding of the period, while sometimes losing sight of the human drama and individual agency that had made the conflicts compelling subjects for historical investigation. The archaeological and scientific investigations that have enriched understanding of the Wars of the Roses during recent decades, including the discovery and identification of Richard III's remains and the analysis of battlefield sites using modern investigative techniques, have provided physical evidence that supplements and sometimes contradicts documentary sources while creating new opportunities for historical interpretation. The skeletal analysis of Richard III's body revealed details about his actual physical condition, including the scoliosis that created spinal curvature, but fell far short of the severe deformity described in Tudor propaganda, while the examination of battle wounds provided evidence about the circumstances of his death that generally confirmed chronicle accounts. The battlefield archaeology conducted at sites like Towton and Bosworth has identified physical evidence of the fighting, including weapons, armor fragments, and human remains that provide information about military equipment and combat techniques, while modern geographical analysis of battlefield topography has enabled better understanding of tactical decisions and the military factors that influenced battle outcomes. The DNA analysis that confirmed Richard III's identification through comparison with living descendants demonstrated how scientific techniques could resolve historical questions that documentary evidence alone could not definitively answer, while raising new questions about the reliability of traditional historical narratives and the complex relationship between historical memory and physical reality. The continuing popular fascination with the Wars of the Roses, evidenced by ongoing production of historical novels, television series, and popular histories devoted to the period, demonstrates the enduring appeal of conflicts that combined political intrigue, military drama, and human tragedy in proportions that continue to engage modern audiences, despite the passage of more than 5 centuries since the events occurred. The adaptation of historical narratives for popular entertainment, while often taking liberties with historical accuracy to enhance dramatic impact or conform to contemporary cultural preferences, has introduced the period to audiences who might never encounter academic historical treatments, while creating cultural representations that influence how contemporary society understands and remembers the medieval past. The debates about historical accuracy versus dramatic license in popular historical fiction and television programming reflect broader questions about the purposes of historical representation and the relationship between entertainment, education in creating public understanding of the past. The transformation of historical figures into fictional characters whose motivations and actions serve narrative purposes rather than historical accuracy raises questions about the ethical responsibilities of writers and producers who shape public perceptions of real people and events while pursuing commercial and artistic objectives. The comparative analysis of the Wars of the Roses, with other civil conflicts and succession crises throughout European history, reveals common patterns in how dynastic disputes, noble factionalism, and governmental weakness could combine to produce extended periods of political instability and military conflict. The English experience during the 15th century shared characteristics with France's religious civil wars of the 16th century, the 30 Years' War in Central Europe, and various succession disputes that affected virtually every European monarchy at different periods, suggesting that the structural factors producing civil conflict transcended the specific circumstances of individual kingdoms. The particular English combination of a weak king, competing noble factions with genuine genealogical claims to the throne, and the absence of effective institutional mechanisms for resolving succession disputes peacefully, created conditions that made extended conflict nearly inevitable, once initial violence had established precedents for armed resistance to royal authority. The resolution of the Wars of the Roses through the establishment of a new dynasty that could claim descent from both competing houses demonstrated one successful model for ending civil conflicts through inclusive political settlements that accommodated competing interests rather than pursuing complete victory and elimination of defeated factions. The legacy of the Wars of the Roses for English national identity and historical consciousness remains significant despite the passage of more than 5 centuries since the conflicts ended, as the period continues to provide reference points for discussions about political leadership, national unity, and the costs of political division. The transformation of the competing dynasties' emblems into enduring symbols of the conflicts, particularly the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, created visual representations that simplified complex political alignments while providing memorable icons that continue to represent the period in popular culture and historical commemoration. The development of the Tudor rose, which combined red and white elements to symbolize the dynastic union accomplished through Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth of York, demonstrated how political symbolism could be deployed to promote narratives about unity and reconciliation following periods of conflict and division. The incorporation of Wars of the Roses, imagery and narratives into English cultural identity through their presence in literature, art, and popular culture has ensured that the period maintains relevance for contemporary audiences while raising questions about how historical memory is constructed and maintained across generations. The ultimate significance of the Wars of the Roses extends beyond the immediate political and military events to encompass fundamental questions about legitimate authority, the relationship between genealogical claims and practical power, and the mechanisms through which societies resolve succession disputes and maintain political stability despite the absence of unanimously accepted rules for determining rightful leadership, questions that remain relevant for understanding political dynamics in both historical and contemporary contexts. The administrative transformations that emerged from the Wars of the Roses period fundamentally altered the structure of English governance and established institutional patterns that would persist throughout the Tudor and Stuart periods, demonstrating that political instability could paradoxically generate innovations in governmental organization and bureaucratic practice. The reduction of noble military power through the systematic elimination of overmighty subjects and the confiscation of estates that had supported private armies enabled subsequent monarchs to assert greater control over military resources and to prevent the emergence of noble magnates capable of challenging royal authority through armed force. The development of more efficient revenue collection systems, including improved customs administration and more systematic exploitation of crown lands, reflected lessons learned from the financial crises that had weakened 15th century monarchs and demonstrated that governmental stability required secure funding sources independent of parliamentary grants. The expansion of royal councils and the professionalization of administrative positions created bureaucratic structures that could maintain governmental continuity despite changes in political leadership, establishing institutional memory and procedural expertise that transcended individual office holders and their partisan loyalties. The legal reforms initiated during the Wars of the Roses period particularly those associated with Edward IV's second reign and Richard III's brief kingship, addressed long-standing problems in the administration of justice while establishing precedents for royal intervention in legal matters that had previously remained under local control. The creation of regional councils with authority to hear cases and enforce royal justice in areas distant from Westminster extended governmental reach into regions that had traditionally exercised substantial autonomy, particularly the Welsh Marches and the northern counties, where local magnates had dominated legal proceedings and often manipulated judicial processes to serve their own interests. The reforms to property law and inheritance procedures address problems created by the numerous attainders and forfeitures that had redistributed landed wealth throughout the period, establishing clearer principles for determining rightful ownership and inheritance rights in situations where competing claims reflected the complex political reversals that had characterized the conflicts. The development of equity jurisdiction and the expansion of chancery proceedings provided alternatives to common law procedures that had proved inadequate for addressing the complex disputes generated by sustained political instability, frequent changes in governmental authority. The economic consequences of the Wars of the Roses extended beyond the immediate costs of military campaigns to encompass broader transformations in patterns of landholding, commercial organization, and international trade that would shape English economic development throughout the Tudor period. The redistribution of landed wealth through forfeitures and new grants created opportunities for families whose loyal service had earned royal favor, while eliminating established noble houses whose political choices had resulted in waper, attainder, demonstrating that political loyalty could generate economic advancement that traditional inheritance patterns would never have permitted. The disruption of established patronage networks and the creation of new relationships between crown and nobility altered patterns of economic dependency and political obligation, as newly elevated families owed their positions entirely to royal favor, rather than inheriting established positions that carried traditional rights and expectations of autonomy from direct royal control. The maintenance of commercial activity, despite political instability, demonstrated the resilience of merchant communities and their ability to adapt to changing political circumstances while pursuing profitable trade opportunities that transcended the immediate concerns of noble factions competing for political supremacy. The wool trade, which remained the foundation of English export commerce throughout the 15th century, continued to generate substantial revenues despite the disruptions created by warfare and political instability, demonstrating that established commercial relationships and market structures possess sufficient strength to withstand periodic interruptions from military operations. The Calais staple, which controlled the export of raw wool and provided substantial customs revenues to whoever controlled the port, represented a crucial economic asset whose strategic importance extended beyond its military significance as England's last continental possession. The cloth industry's expansion during the latter half of the 15th century, reflecting a shift from exporting raw wool to producing finished textiles for domestic consumption and foreign export, demonstrated that economic innovation could proceed despite political instability when market conditions favored new production methods and organizational structures. The growth of London's commercial dominance and its increasing integration into continental trading networks created economic foundations for the city's political importance and its capacity to influence royal succession through its decisions about which claimants to support during succession crises. The demographic impacts of the Wars of the Roses remain difficult to assess with precision given the limitations of available evidence, but the combination of battlefield casualties, executions, and the indirect effects of military operations on civilian populations created patterns of mortality that particularly affected the nobility while leaving most of the population relatively unscathed. The concentration of noble casualties at major battles like Towton, Barnet, and Tewkesbury eliminated substantial portions of the peerage and created succession crises within noble families that required complex legal proceedings to determine rightful heirs and the disposition of family estates. The execution of nobles following battles or as results of attainder proceedings demonstrated the increasingly lethal character of political conflict as traditional restraints on violence against captured enemies broke down under the pressure of sustained warfare and accumulated personal grievances. The relatively limited impact on non-noble populations reflected the concentration of military operations in specific regions during brief campaigning seasons, and the small size of armies relative to England's total population, enabling most communities to maintain normal agricultural and economic activities despite the political instability at the highest levels of society. The educational and cultural developments that continued throughout the Wars of the Roses period demonstrated that intellectual life and artistic production could proceed despite political instability, as patronage from both royal and noble sources supported scholars, artists, and craftsmen whose work transcended the immediate political conflicts. The foundation of educational institutions, including King's College, Cambridge, and Eton College, established by Henry VI, reflected continuing commitment to educational patronage, despite the king's manifest inability to govern effectively, while these institutions' survival through multiple regime changes demonstrated their value to successive governments, regardless of dynastic allegiance. The production of illuminated manuscripts, architectural projects, and artistic commissions continued to employ skilled craftsmen and generate cultural artifacts that reflected late medieval aesthetic sensibilities, while demonstrating that wealthy patrons maintained interest in cultural production despite the uncertainties created by political instability. The literary productions of the period, including both English and Latin works addressing religious, historical, and practical subjects, indicated that intellectual life continued to flourish within monastic and secular contexts while adapting to changing political circumstances and patron preferences. The printing revolution's arrival in England during 1476, when William Caxton established his press at Westminster, coincided with the final phases of the Wars of the Roses and would transform the dissemination of information and the preservation of texts in ways that affected subsequent historical understanding of the conflicts. Caxton's publication of historical chronicles, literary works, and practical texts created new opportunities for preserving and distributing information that manuscript production could never have matched, while the technology's relatively rapid adoption by subsequent printers demonstrated recognition of printing's commercial potential and cultural significance. The selection of texts chosen for early printing reflected both commercial calculations about market demand and cultural judgments about which works deserved preservation and wider distribution, creating a corpus of printed materials that would influence subsequent generations' understanding of late medieval culture and historical events. The capacity to produce multiple identical copies of texts enabled more systematic preservation of historical sources and facilitated the creation of personal libraries among individuals who could never have afforded substantial manuscript collections, democratizing access to information in ways that would have profound long-term consequences for English society. The diplomatic dimensions of the Wars of the Roses involved complex interactions between English dynastic conflicts and continental political developments, as European powers attempted to exploit English instability for their own purposes, while English factions sought foreign support to advance their domestic political objectives. The relationship between English conflicts and French foreign policy demonstrated how continental powers could manipulate English factional divisions to prevent English intervention in continental affairs, as French support alternated between Lancastrian and Yorkist causes depending on calculations about which English faction was more likely to maintain peaceful relations with France. The Burgundian involvement in English politics reflected both dynastic connections through marriages between English and Burgundian ruling families and strategic calculations about preventing French domination of the Low Countries, as Burgundian support for Yorkist causes served to maintain English enmity toward France while preventing English resources from being mobilized against Burgundian interests. The Scottish exploitation of English instability through support for Lancastrian causes and border raids into northern England demonstrated how neighbouring powers could take advantage of civil conflicts to advance territorial ambitions, extract diplomatic concessions from weakened English governments desperate for external support, or at least neutrality. The relationship between the Wars of the Roses and broader European political transformations during the 15th century revealed how English domestic conflicts both influenced and were influenced by continental developments, including the final phases of the Hundred Years' War, the consolidation of French royal authority, and the emergence of new diplomatic practices that would characterize early modern European international relations. The end of English territorial ambitions in France, following the loss of Normandy and Gascony, eliminated a source of international conflict that had preoccupied English governments for centuries, while forcing English monarchs to focus primarily on domestic governance and insular concerns, rather than continental military adventures. The development of resident ambassadors and more systematic diplomatic communications created new mechanisms for international relations that enabled more sophisticated coordination between allied powers and more effective exploitation of enemies' domestic vulnerabilities. The marriage alliances that connected English royalty with continental ruling families created networks of dynastic obligation and strategic interest that influenced succession disputes and military conflicts, while demonstrating that 15th century politics operated increasingly within international contexts that transcended purely domestic concerns. The historiographical evolution in scholarly understanding of the Wars of the Roses reflects changing methodological approaches and interpretive frameworks that have transformed how historians conceptualize the period's significance and its place within broader patterns of English and European historical development. The 19th century constitutional historians, who emphasized the conflict's role in weakening feudal nobility and strengthening royal authority, interpreted the wars as necessary steps in England's constitutional evolution toward parliamentary monarchy and the rule of law, viewing political violence as tragic but ultimately productive in eliminating obstacles to institutional modernization. The 20th century revisionists who questioned traditional narratives about the war's comprehensiveness and social impact emphasized the limited geographical scope of military operations and the continued functioning of governmental and economic institutions, despite political instability, challenging romantic interpretations that portrayed the period as one of complete social breakdown and universal suffering. The prosopographical studies that examined noble families' experiences and political allegiances revealed complex patterns of loyalty and betrayal that defied simple categorization into Lancastrian and Yorkist camps, demonstrating that noble political behavior reflected calculations about family interests and local power dynamics, rather than unwavering commitment to abstract dynastic principles. The gender dimensions of the Wars of the Roses, particularly the prominent roles played by women including Margaret of Anjou, Elizabeth Woodville, Margaret Beaufort, and Margaret of Burgundy, demonstrated that political agency and influence extended beyond formal governmental positions to encompass informal networks of power and patronage that women could mobilize to advance their interests and those of their families. Margaret of Anjou's military leadership and political organization during the 1450s and early 1460s challenged contemporary assumptions about appropriate female behavior, while demonstrating that extraordinary circumstances could enable women to exercise authority that social conventions normally reserved for men. Elizabeth Woodville's transformation from relative obscurity to queen consort and her subsequent influence over patronage and governmental appointments illustrated how marriage to the king could elevate an entire family to positions of power and wealth, while generating resentment among established noble families, displaced by newly risen relatives of the Queen. Margaret Beaufort's persistent advocacy for her son Henry Tudor's claims and her coordination of conspiracies against Richard III demonstrated how maternal ambition and political calculation could combine to advance dynastic interests, despite limited formal authority and substantial practical obstacles. Margaret of Burgundy's sustained support for Yorkist pretenders and her willingness to fund military expeditions against the Tudor regime illustrated how widowed noblewomen with substantial resources and strong family loyalties could influence international politics and threaten established governments through their deployment of financial resources and diplomatic connections. The military technology developments that occurred during the Wars of the Roses period reflected broader European trends toward increased use of gunpowder, weapons, and artillery. though these innovations had not yet achieved the battlefield dominance that would characterize 16th century warfare. The employment of handguns and artillery pieces in both siege operations and occasional field battles demonstrated growing recognition that gunpowder weapons possess significant military potential, though the technology's reliability problems and limited effectiveness against armored opponents meant that traditional weapons, including longbows, crossbows, and edged weapons, remained crucial for battlefield success. The continued importance of heavy cavalry charges in determining battle outcomes, as demonstrated at Bosworth, where Richard III's final charge nearly succeeded in killing Henry Tudor, indicated that mounted knights remained viable tactical forces despite the increasing prevalence of infantry formations and missile weapons that some military theorists believed had made cavalry obsolete. The development of more sophisticated field fortifications and defensive positions, including the entrenchments employed at Northampton and other battles, demonstrated that commanders recognized the tactical advantages of prepared defenses, even as improvements in artillery gradually reduced the effectiveness of static fortifications in siege warfare. The regional variations in how different parts of England experienced the Wars of the Roses reflected the concentration of noble power in specific areas and the strategic importance of certain regions for controlling access routes, economic resources that made military control of these areas crucial for political success. The north of England, particularly Yorkshire and Northumberland, experienced more intensive military operations than southern regions due to the concentration of Neville family power in the area and the region's strategic position between England and Scotland, making northern allegiances crucial for any government seeking to defend the Scottish border or to mobilise military resources from the region's substantial population. The Welsh marches served as recruiting grounds for military forces throughout the period and as strategic corridors for armies moving between Wales and England, with the Marcher Lordship's traditional military organisation and the region's partial autonomy from direct royal control, making the area both strategically valuable and difficult to govern effectively. The southeastern counties, including Kent, Sussex, and Essex, experienced less direct military impact, but played crucial political roles through their commercial importance, proximity to London, and capacity to support or resist governments, depending on their assessment of which faction served their economic interests and political preferences. The ecclesiastical responses to the Wars of the Roses revealed the complex position of church institutions, caught between spiritual obligations to maintain neutrality and practical necessities of accommodating whoever controlled political power, as bishops and abbots attempted to preserve their institutions' resources and privileges while avoiding permanent identification with losing factions that might result in retribution from victorious enemies. The Church's property holdings and substantial revenues made ecclesiastical institutions attractive targets for resource extraction by governments desperate for funds to support military operations, while the clergy's theoretical immunity from military service and their spiritual authority provided some protection against the most extreme demands for financial contributions or direct participation in warfare. The willingness of successive archbishops to perform coronation ceremonies for multiple competing claimants to the throne demonstrated the institutional church's determination to maintain relationships with whoever achieved effective power regardless of the legitimacy of their claims, though individual clergy members sometimes maintained personal loyalties to specific causes that placed them at risk when political fortunes reversed. The development of political cults around Henry VI and other figures associated with the conflicts reflected popular religious sentiment that operated independently of official church positions, demonstrating that ecclesiastical authorities could not entirely control how religious communities interpreted political events or whom they chose to venerate as martyrs or saints. The lasting institutional innovations that emerged from the Wars of the Roses period extended beyond immediate administrative reforms to encompass fundamental changes in how English government operated and how royal authority related to tendros, noble power, creating precedents and institutional structures that would shape English political development throughout the early modern period. The Court of Star Chamber, which developed from the Royal Council's judicial functions and would become a crucial instrument of Tudor governance, originated in practices established during the political instability of the 15th century when traditional legal procedures proved inadequate for addressing the complex problems created by sustained political conflict. The regional councils that evolved into permanent institutions for governing distant regions represented attempts to extend royal authority into areas that had traditionally exercised substantial autonomy, demonstrating recognition that effective government required administrative structures capable of enforcing royal will throughout the realm, rather than relying on the uncertain loyalty of local magnates. The development of more systematic record-keeping and bureaucratic procedures reflected lessons learned about the importance of institutional memory and administrative continuity during periods when frequent changes in political leadership threatened to disrupt governmental operations entirely. The transformation of noble military organization during and after the Wars of the Roses reflected changing relationships between military service and political power, as the traditional feudal levy system that had mobilized armies through hierarchies of obligation gave way to more commercialized military relationships based on cash payments and written contracts. The increasing use of indentures to formalize relationships between lords and their military retainers created more explicitly contractual frameworks for military service that specified obligations and compensation in ways that reduced ambiguity about the nature of service relationships while enabling more precise calculations about the costs of maintaining military forces. The Crown's attempts to regulate and limit private military retaining through legislation addressed concerns that noble military power threatened royal authority and political stability, though the practical difficulties of enforcing these restrictions demonstrated the continued importance of noble military resources for royal government's own military operations. The gradual shift toward reliance on professional soldiers and paid troops rather than feudal levies reflected both the increasing cost and complexity of military operations and the Crown's determination to reduce dependence on noble military power that might be employed against royal authority during succession disputes or political conflicts. The symbolic and ceremonial dimensions of royal authority that developed during the Wars of the Roses period reflected attempts to legitimize contested claims through elaborate public displays and religious rituals that claimed divine sanction for particular rulers, while delegitimizing rivals as usurpers lacking sacred authority. The multiplication of coronation ceremonies as competing claimants sought to establish legitimacy through the transformative ritual that supposedly converted successful military commanders into divinely anointed kings, demonstrated both the ceremony's perceived importance and its increasingly problematic status when applied to multiple competing rulers. The development of heraldic symbolism and royal badges that identified partisan allegiances and proclaimed dynastic legitimacy created visual languages for expressing political loyalties and royal authority that operated alongside more formal legal and constitutional arguments about rightful succession. The funeral ceremonies and tomb monuments created for deceased kings and nobles reflected continuing efforts to shape historical memory and to establish particular interpretations of the conflicts that served the interests of whoever controlled the resources necessary to commission these elaborate commemorations. The ultimate resolution of the Wars of the Roses, through the establishment of the Tudor dynasty and the elimination of alternative claimants, demonstrated that sustained royal authority required both military success and effective governance that could generate sufficient support to prevent renewed challenges. As Henry VII's survival and his dynasty's long-term success reflected his ability to combine ruthless elimination of potential rivals with competent administration that created stability and prosperity after decades of political turmoil and military conflict. The Tudor achievement in preventing renewed civil war and establishing secure succession arrangements that enabled peaceful transfers of power between successive monarchs validated the dynasty's claim to have resolved the conflicts that had torn England apart during the 15th century, though the mechanisms through which this stability was achieved involved substantial violence against potential rivals and systematic elimination of alternative claimants, whose genealogical credentials might have attracted support from nobles dissatisfied with Tudor rule. The transformation of the Wars of the Roses into historical memory and political symbol occurred rapidly as Tudor propagandists constructed narratives that emphasized the horrors of civil conflict and the benefits of strong monarchical authority. creating interpretive frameworks that would influence English political culture for centuries, while serving the immediate purpose of legitimizing a dynasty whose actual claims to the throne remained legally questionable, but whose practical success in establishing stable government had created prescriptive right through sustained possession and competent governance.